In the shadowy town of Raven's Hollow, where mist clings to weathered tombstones like shrouds, appearances mask deadly truths. When a band of ruthless outlaws decided to stake their claim on this fog-shrouded sanctuary, they failed to recognize that the silent man who tends the dead harbored secrets darker than the graves he digs. This is a tale of how a seemingly humble gravedigger's patience, when tested, unleashed a storm of vengeance that would send 3 outlaw gangs to the very ground he'd spent years preparing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the perpetual twilight of Raven's Hollow Cemetery, Solomon Gray worked with mechanical precision, his spade cutting through the earth with practiced efficiency. 20 years of digging graves had taught him the exact depth needed for eternal rest. But today's hole seemed different. As his shovel struck the dark soil, each impact echoed with an ominous finality, as if the earth itself sensed the coming storm. The town of Raven's Hollow straddled the borders of 3 territories, its cemetery perched atop Raven's Bluff overlooking mist-shrouded valleys where law and order held little sway. The town had grown wealthy from the nearby silver mines, but that wealth had drawn predators. The Thorn Gang controlled the northern routes, while Sebastian Cross and his Crimson Riders dominated the south. Between them, Victor the Ghost Petrov's smugglers moved like shadows, profiting from the chaos. Solomon's weathered hands gripped his shovel tighter as hoofbeats approached the cemetery gates. Marcus Deadeye Dixon, Thorn's most notorious enforcer, rode up with 3 men. Their horses' breath steamed in the chill air as they surveyed the graveyard's elaborate monuments and mausoleums, signs of the town's prosperity. "Quite a fancy boneyard you got here, old man," Dixon drawled, his silver spurs catching the weak sunlight. "Shame if anything were to happen to all these expensive memorials." Solomon continued his work, each shovelful of earth precisely placed. "Cemetery's neutral ground," he replied, his voice rough from disuse, "has been since the town's founding." Dixon's laugh held no humor. "Times change, Gravedigger. Mr. Thorne's offering protection now. Small fee, of course. Insurance against accidents." Solomon paused, leaning on his shovel. In the 20 years since he'd arrived in Raven's Hollow, he'd buried 3 generations of townspeople. Each grave had been dug with care, each monument tended with quiet reverence. The dead, he believed, deserved their peace. "No protection needed here," he said quietly. "Just the dead, and those who tend them." Dixon's hand dropped to his gun, but Solomon's stillness gave him pause. There was something in the gravedigger's stance, a coiled tension that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance. "You're making a mistake, old man," Dixon warned. "Nobody refuses Mr. Thorne's generous offer." Solomon straightened, and for the first time Dixon saw his eyes clearly. Eyes that had seen things that haunted darker nights than these. "Perhaps Mr. Thorne's the one making the mistake," Solomon replied, his voice carrying across the cemetery with quiet authority. The words hung in the air like the ever-present mist. Dixon's face darkened with rage, but before he could draw, Solomon's movement blurred. The shovel in his hands became a weapon, its edge catching the sunlight as it knocked Dixon's gun away with devastating precision. The enforcer stumbled back, clutching his numbed hand, while his men gaped in shock. "Leave," Solomon commanded, the shovel returning to its task as if nothing had happened. "Tell Mr. Thorne the dead rest undisturbed here." Dixon and his men retreated, their horses' hooves clattering on the cobblestones. But Solomon knew this was just the beginning. He'd revealed too much, shown a skill that couldn't belong to a simple gravedigger. As he resumed his work, he felt the weight of the silver cross beneath his shirt, a reminder of the life he'd left behind, of the blood-soaked legacy he'd tried to bury. Back in town, Judge Isaac Montgomery watched Dixon's humiliated retreat from his chamber's window. The aging lawman had seen enough violence to recognize the signs of coming bloodshed. His fingers traced the telegram on his desk. A warning from the territorial governor about increased gang activity along the borders. But something about the Gravedigger's confrontation with Dixon nagged at his memory. In the mortuary, Madeline Cross, the undertaker's daughter, watched Dixon and his men ride past, their wounded pride evident in every rigid line of their postures. The silver locket at her throat held a secret of her own, a photograph of her brother Thomas, who'd vanished 3 years ago investigating corruption among the border gangs. She'd known Solomon for years, seeing his dedication to maintaining the cemetery's peace, but now she wondered about the mysteries behind his silence. The gangs won't let this stand, her father, Ezekiel Cross, observed as he prepared his workshop for the business he feared would soon come. Thorne's pride won't allow it. Solomon's different, Madeline replied, remembering moments when she'd glimpsed something beneath the gravedigger's calm exterior. There's more to him than the townspeople know. Her father nodded gravely. 20 years ago, before he came here, there were stories from the border wars, tales of a man they called the Sexton, a ghost who hunted the worst outlaws, leaving only graves behind. As darkness fell over Raven's Hollow, Solomon finished. The new grave, a deeper hole than usual, as if preparing for more than one occupant. In his small cottage near the cemetery gates, he opened a weathered chest hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, a matched pair of custom Colts, their grips worn smooth from years of use, and a badge from a law enforcement agency whose name had been lost to history. The mist thickened as night descended, wrapping the cemetery in its ethereal embrace. From the shadows of the old bell tower, Catherine "Cat" Martinez watched the scene unfold. As Raven's Hollow's telegraph operator, she'd intercepted enough messages between the gangs to know that Solomon's defiance would draw more than just Thorne's attention. Sebastian Cross had been looking for an excuse to move on the northern territories, and Victor Petrov's smugglers were always eager to profit from chaos. What none of them knew was that Cat had her own score to settle. Her father had been Raven's Hollow's last proper lawman before the gangs took control. They'd found his body at the bottom of Raven's Bluff, though everyone knew falling wasn't what killed him. She'd spent years gathering evidence, building a network of informants, waiting for someone with the strength and will to help her strike back. Now, watching Solomon move through the cemetery with lethal grace, she wondered if she'd finally found her ally. There was something in the way he handled himself, a deadly efficiency that spoke of years spent dealing death rather than just burying its aftermath. Solomon knew that somewhere in the darkness, the powers that ruled Raven's Hollow were gathering. The gangs would come for him now, their greed and pride demanding retribution. But he'd spent 20 years tending these grounds, learning every shadow, every monument, every patch of hallowed earth. They would come hunting a gravedigger, but they would find something else entirely. For Solomon Gray had not chosen Raven's Hollow by chance. He'd chosen it because sometimes a man needed to plant himself among the dead to set right what had gone wrong among the living. As he cleaned his guns with practiced care, the silver cross around his neck caught the lamplight, its surface etched with names. Names of those he'd failed to protect in another life, in another time. In the Silver Crown Saloon, Dixon's wounded, pride found comfort in whiskey and dark plans. Sebastian Cross's sister, Eleanor, watched from her private booth as he gathered more men. Her brother's ambitions had always been greater than controlling the Southern Territories, and now Dixon's humiliation provided the perfect spark to ignite a larger conflict. The sound of breaking glass drew her attention to a corner table where one of Victor Petrov's smugglers argued with a local miner. The tension in town was rising like floodwaters against a weakening dam. Eleanor had survived this long by reading. The signs by knowing when to move and when to vanish. Tonight, those signs pointed to an approaching storm that would reshape Raven's Hollow forever. At the telegraph office, Kat's fingers flew across the key, sending encoded warnings to her network of allies in neighboring towns. 20 years of peace in the cemetery was about to end, and the ripples would spread far beyond Raven's Bluff. Tomorrow would bring violence to this peaceful place, but tonight Solomon walked among the tombstones, touching each one with reverence. Near the cemetery gate, a fresh grave marker caught the moonlight. Thomas Cross, beloved son and brother, though no body was found. Solomon paused longer at this stone, his weathered hands tracing letters he himself had carved. The dead were his charge, their rest, his sacred duty, and if the living insisted on disturbing the peace, well, he'd already dug the graves. Dawn broke over Raven's Hollow like a bruise, painting the fog-shrouded cemetery in shades of purple and grey. Solomon Gray had spent the night preparing not just the fresh graves that experience told him would soon be needed, but the grounds themselves. Each monument, each mausoleum, each shadowed recess could become either shelter or trap. The dead, he'd learned long ago, could be powerful allies if you knew their secrets. Marcus Dixon's humiliation had spread through the town like wildfire, carried on whispers and knowing glances. In the Silver Crown saloon, Eleanor Cross watched the enforcers, increasing desperation with calculated interest. Her brother Sebastian's ambitions had always reached beyond their southern territory, but timing was everything in the delicate dance of power. Interesting development, a smooth voice commented. Viktor Petrov materialized from the shadows like the ghost, his nickname suggested, his accent a cultured blend of old-world refinement and frontier practicality. The Russian smuggler's presence in the saloon was unprecedented. He usually operated through intermediaries. The Gravedigger? Eleanor maintained her composure, though Petrov's sudden appearance set her nerves on edge. Hardly seems worth your personal attention. Petrov's smile never reached his ice-blue eyes. A man who can disarm Dixon with a shovel, who tends graves with the precision of a soldier. No, Miss Cross, such a man deserves consideration. Before Eleanor could respond, the saloon's doors burst open. Thorne himself strode in, his massive frame dominating the room. The gang leader's presence in town was another unprecedented event, and Eleanor noticed how Petrov seemed to fade deeper into the shadows. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Where's Dixon?" Thorne's voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. His scarred face bore the marks of countless battles, but it was the cold calculation in his eyes that had kept him in power for so long. The enforcer emerged from his whiskey-soaked corner, trying to straighten himself to attention. "Mr. Thorne, I was just about to what?" Thorne cut him off. "About to explain how a gravedigger made you look like a fool? About to tell me why my authority was challenged in front of the whole town?" The saloon had gone deathly quiet. Even the piano player had frozen mid-note, his fingers hovering over the keys like birds afraid to land. "He's not what he seems," Dixon protested. "The way he moved. No ordinary gravedigger has skills like that." Finally, Thorne's voice dripped sarcasm. "You show a glimmer of intelligence." He turned to address the room at large. "Anyone here know anything about our mysterious sexton?" From her corner table, Kat Martinez tensed. She'd intercepted enough telegrams to know that Thorne's interest in Solomon went beyond wounded pride. Something larger was brewing, something that made the gangs nervous enough to send their leaders personally. Judge Montgomery chose that moment to enter the saloon, his aged frame carrying the authority of his office like a cloak. "Mr. Thorne," he acknowledged with careful neutrality, "an unexpected pleasure to see you in town." Thorne's smile was razor-sharp. "Judge, perhaps you can shed some light on our resident gravedigger. 20 years is a long time to tend to the dead without a past catching up. The cemetery's records are in order, Montgomery replied. Mr. Gray has served this community faithfully. Records can be forged. Petrov's voice drifted from the shadows, causing several people to start. Papers can lie, but skills tell their own truth. Meanwhile, in the mortuary, Madeline Cross worked with grim efficiency, preparing for the violence she knew was coming. Her father had taught her that death was a patient merchant. It didn't matter when payment came due, only that it always did. You've heard the rumors? Ezekiel asked, watching his daughter arrange her tools with the same precision Solomon showed with his shovel. About Solomon, or about why 3 gang leaders are suddenly so interested in a simple gravedigger? Both. Ezekiel pulled a worn leather journal from a hidden compartment in his desk. Your brother's last entry. He was investigating something bigger than gang rivalries. Something about missing Confederate gold, smuggled across borders under the cover of corpses. Madeline's hands stilled. The cemetery. 20 years of graves, her father confirmed. 20 years of perfect records. But Thomas found discrepancies, weights that didn't match, coffins that seemed heavier than they should. At the telegraph office, Kat's fingers flew across the keys, encoding an urgent message to her contacts. The pieces were falling into place. Solomon's arrival 20 years ago coincided with the disappearance of a legendary lawman known as the Sexton, a man who tracked a massive gold shipment to the border before vanishing. In the cemetery, Solomon felt the approaching storm in his bones. He'd chosen this place carefully, 2 decades ago, using the dead to guard secrets that could shake the territories to their foundations. Each grave he'd dug, each monument he'd maintained, helped hide a truth bigger than missing gold or gang rivalries. Judge Montgomery knew pieces of it. The aging lawman had recognized something in Solomon's eyes that first day, 20 years ago, when a quiet stranger had appeared, seeking the gravedigger's position. But even he didn't know the full truth, how the Sexton's crusade had uncovered a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, how the gold was just the beginning. The sound of approaching horses drew Solomon's attention. Through the thinning morning mist, he spotted riders approaching from 3 directions. Thorne's men from the north, Sebastian Cross's crimson riders from the south, and shadows that could only be Petrov's smugglers, moving through the graves like ghosts. Quite a reception. Judge Montgomery's voice came from behind him. The old lawman had approached silently, a skill that suggested his own past held secrets. 3 gangs working together. Must be something mighty valuable buried in my cemetery. Solomon noted his choice of words. Your cemetery? I've been waiting a long time for someone to help dig up the truth, Montgomery replied cryptically. Thomas Cross came close before they silenced him, but he left something behind, something that could expose it all. The approaching riders were close enough now that Solomon could make out Dixon's face, twisted with anticipation of revenge, but it was the figure beside him that drew his attention. A woman in a black dress, her silver locket catching the morning light. Madeline Cross. Montgomery supplied, though that's not her real name. 20 years is a long time for secrets to stay buried, Sexton. Solomon's hand drifted to the silver cross beneath his shirt, its weight suddenly heavier. Some secrets are buried for a reason, Judge. Some graves should stay closed. And the others? Montgomery's eyes held a challenge. The ones filled with nothing but lies and stolen gold. A raven's harsh cry split the morning air as Dixon's men spread out among the tombstones. Behind them, Eleanor Cross dismounted with fluid grace, her black dress seeming to absorb the weak sunlight. The silver locket at her throat wasn't just for show. It held something Thomas Cross had discovered before his disappearance, something that made her both valuable and dangerous to every power player in Raven's Hollow. My brother sends his regards, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the hallowed ground. "He's particularly interested in the grave you dug 3 years ago. The empty one." Solomon's expression remained impassive, but Judge Montgomery noticed how his hand tightened on the shovel. "Careful, Miss Cross," the gravedigger warned. "Some questions are better left unasked." Like why a legendary lawman would spend 20 years burying bodies and secrets? Viktor Petrov emerged from behind a marble angel, his accent thicker with anticipation. Or why do those bodies always weigh more going into the ground than they should? Dixon leveled his gun with trembling hands. "Time to dig your own grave, old man." From her vantage point in the bell tower, Kat Martinez watched the pieces align like a deadly chess game. Her father's old pocket watch ticked steadily. Timing would be everything. The telegraph lines had been humming all night with encrypted messages, and she'd decoded enough to know that forces beyond the three gangs were converging on Raven's Hollow. In the mortuary, Madeline Cross felt the weight of her brother's badge, hidden beneath the floorboards with his real journal. The one their father had shown earlier was a decoy, meant to draw attention from the truth. Thomas had discovered something in those graves that went beyond stolen gold, something that had gotten him killed. Solomon's grip shifted on the shovel, and for a moment, the morning light caught the edge of his sleeve, revealing the edge of a tattoo, a distinctive mark that made Judge Montgomery's breath catch. He'd seen that symbol before, on classified documents about a secret unit during the border wars, men who'd been tasked with tracking not just Confederate gold, but something far more dangerous. The confrontation that had been brewing for 20 years was about to explode, but as Solomon faced the approaching storm, he knew the real battle wouldn't be fought with guns alone. The truth had been buried in Raven's Hollow's soil for 2 decades, watered with blood and fertilized with lies. Each grave held a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, would shake the very foundations of the territories. And as the morning mist finally burned away, Solomon Gray, the man once known as the Sexton, prepared to unleash 20 years of carefully buried vengeance. The dead had kept his secret safe. Now it was time for them to give up their gold, their lies, and their terrible truths. The harvest of justice was about to begin, and its price would be paid in blood. What happened next would be whispered about in Raven's Hollow for generations. Dixon's finger had barely tightened on the trigger when Solomon's shovel moved with impossible speed. The blade caught the morning light as it spun through the air, knocking Dixon's gun away while simultaneously deflecting shots from 2 of Thorne's men. In the same fluid motion, Solomon dropped and rolled behind a marble monument, emerging with twin Colts that seemed to materialize from nowhere. His first shots disarmed 3 more gunmen before they could properly aim, while his next 2 caught the ornate carvings on a nearby mausoleum, sending stone shards spraying into the faces of Petrov's advancing men. Magnificent, Viktor Petrov breathed, his cultured accent tinged with genuine admiration. "The legends didn't do you justice, Sexton." Eleanor Cross moved with deliberate grace toward Thomas's empty grave marker. "And 20 years of secrets," she called out. 20 years of hiding what you really are. And for what? The gold's already been moved, hasn't it? From his position behind the monument, Solomon's laugh carried a cold edge that made even Dixon shiver. "You think this was about Confederate gold? Thomas figured it out before you silenced him. The gold was just a cover for something far more valuable." In the bell tower, Kat Martinez's fingers worked the telegraph key with desperate speed. The coded message she'd intercepted from the territorial capital confirmed her worst fears. A specialized military unit was already en route to Raven's Hollow, not to restore order, but to ensure certain secrets stayed buried. Judge Montgomery's hand drifted to his coat pocket, where a sealed letter from Thomas Cross had waited 3 Years to be delivered. The young lawman had known he was marked for death and had arranged for this final message to be held until the right moment. That moment had finally arrived. The ledgers, Eleanor realized, her hand clutching the silver. Locket. The weights recorded in the burial records. They weren't just tracking gold shipments, were they? Solomon's voice carried clearly across the cemetery. Your brother was clever, Miss Cross. He decoded the pattern. Each burial record contained a piece of a larger cipher. Weight discrepancies, dates, even the arrangement of the graves themselves. All part of a map leading to something that would bring down not just the gangs, but the very foundations of territorial power. Viktor Petrov's usual composure cracked slightly. The weapons cache. So the rumors were true. Weapons. Thorne's harsh laugh boomed across the tombstones. You think this is about guns? Dixon, tell them what you found in the territorial archives. The enforcer's face had gone pale. Missing chemical weapons from the war. Experimental stuff that was supposed to be destroyed. The kind that could wipe out whole towns if it fell into the wrong hands. Or the right ones, Eleanor added softly. Depending on your definition of right. At the edge of the cemetery, Doctor, Regina Wells emerged from her carriage, her medical bag heavy with more than just healing supplies. As the town's physician for 15 years, she'd helped Solomon maintain his cover, signing death certificates that masked the true contents of certain coffins. The military's mobilizing more than just the shadow units, she announced, her voice carrying urgency. They're bringing something else, something from the old weapons program. A muscle twitches in Solomon's jaw. Project Lazarus. You know, about that? Petrov's composure cracked further. Know about it? Solomon's laugh was bitter. I helped shut it down during the war. Supposedly destroyed all samples of the compound. A chemical agent that could reanimate dead tissue, turn casualties into weapons, pure nightmare fuel. Eleanor's face went pale. The weight discrepancies in the burial records weren't just about gold or weapons, Dr. Wells confirmed. Some of those coffins contain evidence of early experiments, failed attempts that needed to be hidden. In the funeral parlor's basement, Madeline Cross discovered another hidden compartment behind the strongbox. Inside lay her brother's real, final message, a map of the cemetery with certain graves marked in a complex pattern. When held up to light, invisible ink revealed a chilling message. They're not all dead. Through her telescope in the bell tower, Kat Martinez spotted something that made her blood run cold. Among the approaching army units, she recognized the insignia of the infamous Resurrection Corps, a unit officially disbanded after the war, but whispered to continue their dark work in secret. Judge Montgomery unfolded Thomas Cross's sealed letter, his hands trembling as he read. My God, he whispered, the weapons program wasn't shut down. It evolved. They're not planning to redraw borders. They're planning to raise an army that can't be killed. Solomon's voice cut through the growing horror. That's why this cemetery, consecrated ground, old beliefs about hallowed soil, preventing the dead from rising. I've spent 20 years making sure certain graves stay closed, certain secrets stay buried. In the mortuary, Madeline Cross removed the final floorboard, revealing not just her brother's badge and journal, but a metal strongbox. Inside lay proof of everything, documents, photographs, and most damning of all, a list of names reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. The graves, Judge Montgomery spoke up, understanding dawning in his aged eyes. You've been using them to hide evidence. Each burial contains a piece of the puzzle, protected by hallowed ground, that even the gangs wouldn't dare desecrate. Solomon emerged from behind the monument, his Colts trained steadily on multiple targets. Thomas Cross wasn't the first honest lawman to discover the truth, just the most recent to die for it. I chose this place because some secrets need consecrated ground to keep them safe. Some lies can only be buried in hallowed soil. Eleanor's fingers worked the clasp of her locket. Then perhaps it's time for a resurrection. The locket opened, revealing not a photograph, but a tiny key. Thomas left. This with me before he disappeared. Said when the time came, I'd know which lock it fits. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist to reveal new riders approaching from all directions. But these weren't gang members. These were army uniforms, moving with the precision of men trained for darker purposes than ordinary soldiering. Looks like we're about to have company, Petrov observed, his accent thickening with tension, the kind that doesn't leave witnesses. Solomon's expression hardened. You all have a choice to make. Those men coming aren't here to arrest anyone. They're here to bury everything, the weapons, the evidence, and anyone who knows about them. The kind of burial that doesn't need a gravedigger. Thorne's scarred face showed the first flicker of real fear. How many? Enough to fill every empty grave in this cemetery, Solomon replied grimly, unless we work together. A raven landed on Thomas Cross's empty grave marker, its dark eyes reflecting the approaching storm of violence. The gangs that had come to kill a gravedigger now faced a choice between joining him or being buried by forces far darker than any outlaw band. In the bell tower, Kat Martinez made her own decision. Her fingers returned to the telegraph key, sending out a message she'd waited years to transmit. Across 3 territories, honest lawmen who'd been gathering evidence, building cases, and, waiting for the right moment, received the signal they'd been preparing for. The weapon caches hidden in Solomon's graves weren't just evidence of past crimes. They were proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. And now, as army units converged on Raven's Hollow, the dead would finally give up their secrets in ways that would shake the territories to their core. Solomon Gray, the man once known as the Sexton, had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. Each grave he'd dug, each secret he'd buried, each piece of evidence he'd hidden, all of it had led to this confrontation. The time for hiding behind the facade of a simple gravedigger was over. The war for the soul of the territories was about to begin, and it would start here, in a cemetery where a patient man had spent 2 decades preparing the ground for a very different kind of harvest. The revelation about Project Lazarus transformed the cemetery's atmosphere from tense standoff to desperate alliance. Even Thorne's scarred face showed genuine fear at the approaching resurrection corps. Dixon's hands shook as he retrieved his fallen gun, but this time he offered it grip first to Solomon. 20 years of playing gravedigger, Thorne mused, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, all to keep their abominations in the ground. Not just keep them there, Solomon replied, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. To gather evidence, build a case strong enough that even the territorial government couldn't bury it. Thomas Cross was helping me before they silenced him. Eleanor's silver locket gleamed as she moved toward the funeral parlor. Then perhaps it's time we heard what my brother has to say. She held up the tiny key. This isn't for a lock, it's for a music box, one that plays a very specific tune. Dr. Wells's eyes widened with understanding. The cemetery's layout, the specific arrangement of the graves, they form musical notes when viewed from above. A cipher, Judge Montgomery realized, hidden in plain sight all these years. The approaching sound of military drums carried across Raven's Bluff, mixing with the morning mist like a funeral dirge. Kat Martinez's voice crackled through a hidden speaker system Solomon had installed throughout the cemetery years ago. Resurrection Corps at the North Gate, she reported. They're deploying some kind of chemical dispersal units. More forces are approaching from the east and west. They're trying to surround the cemetery. Victor Petrov's network of smugglers emerged from various hiding spots among the tombstones, their usual stealth replaced by urgent purpose. My men have explosives, the Russian offered. We can seal the cemetery access points. Not good enough, Solomon shook his head. They'll just blast their way in. We need to activate the real defenses. Madeline Cross emerged from the funeral parlor's basement, her brother's map clutched tightly. The pattern in the graves, it's not just music. It's a sequence. Certain tombs are connected by underground tunnels. The entire cemetery is one giant mechanism. Solomon moved with renewed purpose toward the central mausoleum, its marble facade bearing the names of Ravens Hollow's founding families. Thomas figured it out before they killed him. Left the key with his sister, the map with Madeline, and the final piece with the judge. A failsafe in case they got to him. Through her telescope, Kat Martinez spotted more details that chilled. Her blood. Among Blake's forces were men carrying strange brass devices, modified musical instruments that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. They brought resonators, she reported through the speaker system. Some kind of sonic technology. They're planning to override your control of the grounds. Petrov cursed in Russian. The old stories were true then. Music to command the dead. Not quite, Dr. Wells interjected, pulling a leather-bound journal from her medical bag. Solomon and I have been studying the project's methodology. They didn't just reanimate corpses, they created a form of sonic control over specific nerve clusters, but they could never maintain it in consecrated ground. Solomon's eyes narrowed. That's why they need the chemical dispersal units. They're planning to desecrate the entire cemetery and break the holy ground's protection, then use the resonators to seize control of everything we've kept contained. Eleanor worked the music box mechanism again, this time in a different pattern. Deep beneath the cemetery, something massive shifted. The sound of hydraulics and ancient gears echoed through the tunnels Solomon had spent decades preparing. "Sexton!" Blake's voice boomed across the hallowed ground. 20 years is long enough to play with corpses. The project needs its property returned. Property? Dr. Wells spat the word. Those were people before your experiments. Solomon's reply carried the weight of decades of carefully planned vengeance. You want your property, Blake. Let's see how it responds to your presence. Eleanor inserted the tiny key into an almost invisible hole in the central mausoleum's cornerstone. The musical tune that emerged was otherworldly, its notes seeming to resonate with the very ground beneath their feet. Throughout the cemetery, certain graves began to shift. "My God," Thorne breathed, watching as hidden mechanisms activated beneath the hallowed ground. The cemetery's true purpose was revealing itself, not just as a burial ground, but as an elaborate trap designed to contain and, if necessary, destroy the evidence of Project Lazarus. Those aren't just graves, Judge Montgomery understood. At last, they're containment units, blessed ground reinforced with steel and concrete. Solomon's voice carried a grim satisfaction. Thomas Cross helped me modify them. Each one designed to keep something in or out. Colonel Blake's forces had reached the cemetery gates, their dark uniforms like a stain against the morning light. The chemical dispersal units hummed with ominous purpose, ready to release whatever horror they'd brought to reclaim their creations. "Last chance, Sexton," Blake called out. "Surrender the evidence and we'll make it quick." Solomon's response was to nod to Eleanor. She turned the tiny key one more quarter rotation, and the true music of the dead began to play. Throughout the cemetery, mechanisms 20 years in the making shuddered to life. The war for Ravens Hollow's soul was about to begin, and its first battle would be fought with weapons neither side had fully prepared for. The morning sun revealed strange shadows moving beneath certain graves. Not the project's reanimated horrors, but something Solomon had spent 2 decades preparing. If Blake wanted to unleash hell in this hallowed ground, he'd find the dead had chosen their own allegiance long ago. Judge Montgomery pulled a set of schematics from his coat. These tunnels aren't just for containment. The founding families of Ravens Hollow, they knew something was coming, built this place as more than just a cemetery. A fortress, Madeline breathed, overlaying her brother's map with the judge's plans. The graves are arranged in defensive patterns, like a giant chessboard. Solomon nodded grimly. Those old families had secrets of their own, ways of binding and controlling darker forces. I've spent 20 years learning their methods, adapting them. The project thinks they're the only ones who know how to manipulate death. Thorne's men had taken up positions among the monuments, their usual bravado replaced by grim determination. Dixon organized them with newfound purpose, understanding that their petty gang rivalries meant nothing compared to what Blake intended to unleash. If they desecrate this ground, Dr. Wells warned, there's no telling what might break free. Not just the project's subjects, but older things. Things the founding families buried here for good reason. Colonel Blake's voice carried across the cemetery again, but this time it held a note of desperation. The project is bigger than you know, Sexton. We're trying to save the territories, the things coming from beyond the borders. We need weapons to fight them. By becoming what you fear? Solomon's reply was thunder. By turning the dead against the living? There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, Blake. That's why this place exists. Why did the old families choose this ground? The resonators began to hum, their brass surfaces glowing brighter. The chemical dispersal units spun up with a sickly whine. But Solomon Gray, the man who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, simply smiled. You want to wake the dead, Blake? His hands moved to the twin Colts, blessed ammunition gleaming in the chambers. Let's see who they answer to. The first wave of Blake's forces hit Solomon's defenses like a dark tide. Against ancient stone, the resonator's otherworldly music clashed with Eleanor's music box tune, creating discordant harmonies that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Chemical fog from the dispersal units crept between the tombstones, withering grass and corroding marble. But Solomon hadn't spent 20 years merely digging graves. Hidden brass pipes beneath the cemetery grounds suddenly released blessed water in precise patterns, creating barriers of consecrated mist that forced Blake's chemical agents to recoil. The hydraulic systems Thomas Cross had helped design activated, raising certain tombstones to create defensive walls, while lowering others to reveal prepared firing positions. Clever bastard, Petrov admired, watching the cemetery transform. You've turned their own sonic technology against them, Dr. Wells worked quickly, distributing specially prepared ammunition to Thorne's men and Petrov's smugglers. Bullets blessed by 3 different faiths, she explained, dipped in holy water and carved with binding runes. The old families knew what they were doing. From her bell tower position, Kat Martinez coordinated the defense through the hidden speaker system. Second wave incoming. They're bringing up something big, some kind of mobile resonator platform. Through the chemical fog, they could see it. A massive brass and steel construct mounted on steam-powered wheels, its array of pipes and horns already beginning to pulse with that sickly light. Colonel Blake stood atop it, his dark uniform now adorned with strange mechanical additions. You think your blessed grounds can stop progress, Sexton? Blake's amplified voice boomed across the cemetery. The project has evolved beyond such superstitions. The dead belong to science now. The mobile resonator platform's main horn released a blast of sonic energy that shook the very ground. Several of the defensive walls crumbled, and dark shapes began to stir in the graves Blake's forces had already desecrated. But Solomon smiled grimly. Science, Blake? Let's see how it handles older powers. He nodded to Eleanor, who turned the music box's key in a complex pattern. The tune that emerged was ancient, not the project's mechanical harmonics, but something that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The founding family's tombs began to glow with a soft blue light. My God, Judge Montgomery breathed. The old songs, the ones they used to bind, things that should stay buried, Solomon finished. Blake's not the only one who knows how to wake the dead. Difference is, I know how to control what comes up. The ground before Blake's forces erupted as something massive emerged, not one of the project's reanimated subjects, but a guardian the founding families had bound centuries ago. Its form was difficult to look at directly, a shifting mass of burial shrouds and blessed steel animated by purposes older than the territory itself. Madeline Cross consulted her brother's map frantically. There are more. Each founding family, bound one as a protector. They're not undead, they're more like angels, dark ones. Watchers, Dr. Wells supplied. The old families called them Graveborn, built this cemetery to hold them in check until they were needed. Blake's forces opened fire, but their bullets passed harmlessly through the Graveborn Guardian's shifting form. Its response was devastating, burial shrouds extending like whips to snatch soldiers and equipment alike, dragging them down into newly opened graves that sealed themselves with ancient finality. The mobile resonator platform's sonic attacks seemed to pass right through the Guardian, while its own presence disrupted the machine's carefully tuned frequencies. Blake's expression shifted from confidence to genuine fear as he realized what he faced. "You fools," he shouted. "We're trying to protect humanity. The things coming across the borders. We need weapons like Project Lazarus to fight them." Solomon's voice carried clearly through the chaos. "And what happens when your weapons turn on their masters? When the dead refuse to go back to their graves?" He raised his blessed Colts. The old families understood. Some forces can only be contained, never controlled. Through the chaos of battle, Madeline Cross noticed something crucial in her brother's maps. The Graveborn aren't just guardians. They're connected to bloodlines. Each founding family's tomb channels their ancestors' power. This revelation hit just as Eleanor's music box tune shifted to a minor key. The blue glow from the family tombs intensified, and more Graveborn emerged, each one distinct in its manifestation. From the Macpherson crypt rose a guardian wreathed in Scottish tartan and ancient oaths. The Ramirez Mausoleum released a protector wrapped in conquistador steel and colonial-era blessing. "The old families," Dr. Wells breathed, consulting. Her journals. They weren't just wealthy settlers. They were warrior priests, mystics, demon hunters, each bringing their own traditions of binding and protecting. Viktor Petrov's scholarly side emerged through his usual pragmatism. "I've seen records of similar guardians in the old world. Different names, same purpose, beings bound through sacred pacts to protect hallowed ground. But as more of Blake's forces breached the outer defenses and more resonators joined the assault, Solomon knew the real test was still to come. The Graveborn Guardians were just the first line of defense. The true secret of Raven's Hollow Cemetery, the one Thomas Cross had died protecting, lay deeper still. In the bell tower, Kat Martinez's fingers flew across her telegraph key, sending encoded updates to a network of allies. The fate of more than just a cemetery hung in the balance. If Blake succeeded in desecrating this ground, in seizing control of what lay buried here, no territory would be safe from what would follow. Colonel Blake's forces responded with escalating technological horror. More resonator platforms emerged. From the chemical fog, each one crowned with brass horns and crackling with electrical malice. But these weren't just sonic weapons. They were attempting to replicate the founding family's binding magic through scientific means. That's why they needed the project's test subjects, Solomon explained as he reloaded his blessed ammunition. Not just to reanimate the dead, but to understand how the old bindings worked. They're trying to industrialize sacred power. Judge Montgomery's aged face showed grim understanding. That's what Thomas discovered. The project isn't just about creating weapons. They want to mass-produce miracles, control the very forces that separate life from death. On the resonator platform, Blake's mechanical additions began to spark with unholy purpose. "You think your ancient superstitions can stand against progress?" Science has unlocked the secrets of your binding, Sexton. Watch what modern ingenuity can do with old power. The platform's main horn released a blast of corrupted energy that struck the McPherson Guardian. For a moment, the ancient protector's form wavered, its burial shrouds beginning to unravel under the assault of industrialized profanity. But Solomon and Eleanor were ready. As the music box's tune reached a crescendo, the very grounds of the cemetery seemed to pulse with accumulated decades of blessed purpose. Every grave Solomon had dug, every prayer he'd whispered over 20 years of vigilance created a web of consecration that even Blake's twisted science couldn't fully corrupt. The grave-born guardians rallied, their ancient powers reinforced by Solomon's modern devotion. The McPherson protector's tartan wrappings ignited with blue fire, while the Ramirez Guardian's colonial steel rang with the authority of centuries of hallowed purpose. The war for Raven's Hollow had become more than a battle between science and superstition. It was a clash between two ways of understanding death itself, one seeking to dominate it through mechanical means, the other respecting the ancient boundaries that separated the worlds of the living and the dead. As the battle raged across hallowed ground, Kat Martinez intercepted a transmission that changed everything. "Solomon!" Her voice crackled through the speakers. "Blake's got reinforcements coming, but they're not military. Private security force, Pinkerton badges, but different. Iron Valley Security." Solomon spat the name like a curse. "The project's cleanup crew. When science fails, they send men with guns and no souls to finish the job." Dr. Wells paled at the name. They were the ones who eliminated the project's early test subjects, burned whole towns to contain outbreaks that were really failed experiments. Through the chemical fog and sonic disruption, they could see new forces approaching. Men in black dusters with red armbands, carrying weapons that looked more like torture devices than guns. Their leader rode a mechanical horse, its brass joints steaming and eyes glowing with unnatural fire. "Director Kane," Blake called out, relief evident in his voice. "The situation is more complex than anticipated. The cemetery has defenses." The mechanical horse's hooves struck sparks from the cobblestones as Kane dismounted. His face was a masterpiece of surgical modification. Brass plates replacing skin where project experiments had left their mark. "Defenses can be broken, Colonel. Everything dies, eventually." Eleanor worked the music box frantically, but Kane produced a device that emitted a countering frequency. The grave-born guardians shuddered, their ancient forms struggling against this new technological assault. The founding families weren't the only ones who understood death's secrets. Kane's voice was metallic, processed through brass tubes that replaced his damaged throat. But they were limited by their reverence, their respect for boundaries. Solomon's blessed bullets seemed to have little effect on Kane's modified troops. Their black dusters proved to be more than cloth, some kind of alchemically treated armor that rejected sacred ammunition. "The tunnels!" Madeline shouted, consulting her brother's map. "If they're coming from the north, we can use the underground network to flank them." Judge Montgomery's aged face showed new determination. "The old families built more than just burial chambers down there. There are weapons stored in the deeper vaults, blessed by 3 generations of warrior priests." Thorne and his men volunteered to hold the surface, while Solomon led a team below. Dixon, seeking redemption for his earlier aggression, insisted on joining them. "Been in plenty of tight spots," he said, checking his gun. "Never thought I'd be fighting alongside a legend to save a graveyard." As they descended into the tunnel network, Dr. Wells shared a disturbing revelation. Kane's modifications, they're based on recovered notes from Project Lazarus. They didn't just experiment on the dead. They found ways to replace living tissue with mechanized components, creating hybrids of man and machine. The tunnels beneath Raven's Hollow Cemetery proved to be more than simple passages. Ancient runes glowed faintly on the walls, their power strengthened by 20 years of Solomon's quiet maintenance. Each intersection was marked with symbols from different faiths, crosses, crescents, stars, and signs older still. "The founding families," Eleanor observed, her music box providing soft illumination. They weren't just different religions, protecting the same ground. They were working together, combining their sacred traditions into something stronger. Petrov's scholarly knowledge proved valuable once again. "I've seen similar collaborations in Europe's older cemeteries. When different faiths face a common enemy, they sometimes find ways to merge their protective powers." A mechanical whirring from above indicated that Kane's forces were deploying more devices. The ceiling dust shifted as massive sonic pulses tried to penetrate the hallowed earth, but the runes flared brighter, holding firm against the technological assault. "They're trying to corrupt the entire cemetery at once," Solomon explained as they moved deeper. "Break all the bindings simultaneously." "But they don't understand. This place doesn't just protect the dead. It protects something far more dangerous." The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that took their breath away. Circular tiers descended into darkness, each level lined with sarcophagi bearing the marks of different faiths. At the center, a pillar of pure light rose from a well of blessed water. "The source," Judge Montgomery whispered, "the real reason the founding families chose this location. They found something here, a wellspring of power that blurs the line between life and death. The project wants to control death through science." Solomon's voice echoed in the chamber. "But there are older forces at work, powers that demand respect, not domination." Before they could reach the central well, a section of the chamber wall exploded inward. Kane's mechanical horse burst through, its rider's brass-plated face reflecting the sacred light in disturbing ways. Behind him, Iron Valley troops rappelled down on cables of alchemically treated steel. "Magnificent." Kane's processed voice held genuine appreciation. "No wonder our resonators couldn't fully penetrate the ground. You've been maintaining ancient wards with modern dedication, adapting old beliefs to new threats." Solomon raised his blessed Colts. "Last warning, Kane. This place has rules older than any of us. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed." The mechanical horse's eyes flared brighter as Kane laughed, a sound like grinding gears. "Boundaries exist to be broken, Sexton. Progress demands it. The project understands what the founding families never could. Death itself is just another force to be harnessed." Above them, the battle between Blake's forces and the Graveborn Guardians reached new intensity. The very ground shook as ancient powers clashed with corrupted science. But here, deep beneath the cemetery, an even more crucial confrontation was about to begin. Solomon Gray had spent 20 years protecting this chamber, maintaining the delicate balance between multiple faiths' power. Now he faced an enemy who sought to industrialize death itself, to mass-produce miracles without understanding their true cost. The chamber's architecture revealed itself in layers of meaning as the sacred light pulsed. Each tier represented a different era, different faiths, adding their protections over centuries. Native American totems stood alongside Christian crosses, Jewish stars merged with Islamic crescents, and older symbols defied easy categorization. The founding families weren't the first to guard this place, Dr. Wells realized, consulting a weathered journal. They inherited a legacy stretching back before recorded history. Each generation adds their own bindings, their own prayers. Kane's mechanical troops spread out along the tiers, their modified weapons humming with corrupted energy. The brass plates in Kane's face shifted as he smiled, revealing teeth replaced with metallic spikes. Your precious faiths are just primitive attempts to understand universal forces, his processed voice echoed. Project Lazarus has decoded the underlying principles. Death is just another form of energy to be harnessed. The mechanical horse's hooves struck sparks from ancient stone as it moved closer to the central well. Each step seemed to cause the sacred light to flicker and dim. Solomon noticed how the blessed water recoiled from the creature's presence. Like oil separating from water, the horse, Madeline whispered, studying her brother's map. Thomas wrote something about it. It's not just mechanical, it's a containment unit. Inside, the project's first success, Kane confirmed proudly. A perfect fusion of man, machine, and reanimated tissue. Poor Colonel Harrison volunteered, or what was left of him after the early experiments. His consciousness drives the mechanical systems, while blessed silver keeps his restored tissues from decay. The horror of this revelation was interrupted by new sounds from above. The battle on the surface had shifted. Kat's voice crackled through hidden speakers. Blake's forces are falling back. The Graveborn are. Something's wrong. The Guardians are changing. Eleanor's music box suddenly emitted a discordant note. The sacred light pulsed erratically as Kane produced a small brass device from his duster. Fascinating how your ancient music box interfaces with the site's energy, he mused. But primitive technology compared to our modern understanding. Observe. The device released a complex series of tones that seemed to twist in the air like visible sound. The runes on the chamber walls flickered as if in pain. Above them, they could hear the Graveborn Guardians howling, not with rage, but agony. You're not just trying to control them, Judge Montgomery realized with horror. You're trying to convert them, transform sacred guardians into... What? Kane's mechanical smile widened. Into the next generation of Project Lazarus. Why simply reanimate the dead when you can industrialize divine power itself? Imagine an army of mass-produced miracles, sacred guardians stripped of their outdated religious restrictions and reprogrammed to serve progress. The chamber's blessed water began to churn as Kane's device increased its output. The mechanical horse's eyes flared brighter, Colonel Harrison's trapped consciousness responding to the corrupted frequencies. Throughout the cemetery above, they could hear Blake's resonators joining the harmonic assault. But Solomon Gray had not spent 20 years maintaining these defenses without learning their deepest secrets. His hands moved to the silver cross at his neck, not just a symbol of faith, but a key forged from the combined beliefs of all who had guarded this place. You want to see real power, Kane? The cross began to glow as Solomon stepped toward the central well. Let me show you what happens when you respect the old boundaries instead of trying to break them. Solomon's silver cross illuminated the chamber with pure, untainted light as he approached the central well. The sacred water began to respond, rising in a spiral around him like a living thing. Each droplet caught the light differently, creating a kaleidoscope of holy symbols from every faith that had ever guarded this ground. Kane's mechanical troops raised their weapons, but their modified ammunition seemed to dissolve in the blessed mist. The brass plates in Kane's face contracted as he realized his technological advantages were being stripped away by powers older than science. Impossible. Kane's processed voice crackled with static. We mapped every frequency, calculated every resonance. There's no mystical force that can't be quantified. That's where you're wrong, Solomon replied, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of devotion. You tried to turn sacred power into a resource to exploit, but true power comes from service, not domination. The mechanical horse reared, Colonel Harrison's trapped consciousness sensing something that Kane's instruments couldn't measure. The ancient chamber seemed to pulse with accumulated centuries of faith and protection. The source isn't just a wellspring of power, Dr. Wells explained, her medical knowledge merging with older wisdom. It's a nexus where multiple faiths found common ground, different paths leading to the same sacred truth. Eleanor's music box began playing on its own, its tune harmonizing with the chamber's natural resonance. The walls themselves seemed to sing as centuries of stored prayers activated at once. Each tier of the circular chamber lit up sequentially, revealing intricate patterns carved into the stone. "The patterns!" Madeline gasped, comparing them to her brother's map. "They're not just decorative, they're a circuit, a channel for divine energy that encompasses the entire cemetery." Kane's response was to push his corrupted technology to its limits. The brass device in his hand whined as he increased its power, trying to override the chamber's ancient harmonies. His mechanical troops deployed resonators of their own, creating a web of industrial frequencies meant to trap and redirect sacred energy. "You think your antiquated beliefs can stand against modern innovation?" Kane's metallic voice held a desperate edge. "We've improved upon nature itself, made death bow to the will of science." As if in response to his blasphemy, the mechanical horse suddenly bucked violently. Colonel Harrison's consciousness, trapped within its brass and steel prison, began fighting against its technological restraints. The blessed water rising from the well had awakened something that Kane's machines couldn't control, the human soul's innate recognition of sacred truth. "Harrison's breaking free," Dr. Wells observed. "Your machines can corrupt the body, Kane, but they can't fully chain the spirit. Not in this place." The sacred water's ascent revealed something Kane hadn't anticipated. Ancient glyphs carved into the well's interior, spiraling down into unfathomable depths. Each symbol represented a different aspect of death's true nature, insights gathered by centuries of guardians. "The project's fundamental flaw," Solomon declared, his voice carrying divine resonance, "was thinking death could be reduced to scientific principles. But it's not just a biological process, it's a doorway, one that should remain closed." Kane's transformation continued, his human frame becoming a grotesque cathedral of brass and steel. Pipes and tubes burst from his back, each one designed to siphon and redirect sacred energy. His face split open like a mechanical flower, revealing layers of crystalline lenses meant to analyze and quantify divine power. "You're still thinking too small, Sexton." Kane's voice emerged from multiple speakers now, each pitched to a different harmonic frequency. "Death isn't a doorway. It's an untapped resource. The project has found ways to harvest the energy released when souls depart their mortal shells." Dr. Wells's eyes widened with horrified understanding as she consulted her journals. "The weight, discrepancies in the burial records. You weren't just hiding gold or weapons in those coffins, you were measuring soul energy." The mechanical horse carrying Harrison's trapped consciousness began to shake violently as Kane's transformation affected its systems. The blessed water touched its brass flanks, and for a moment Harrison's actual face appeared in the metal, eyes wide with decades of tortured awareness. The horse wasn't your first success, Solomon realized. It was your first failure. Harrison's soul rejected complete mechanization, so you trapped him between life and death. Use him as a battery to power your abominations. You wanted to see what really protects this place. Solomon's voice echoed with authority that transcended his role as gravedigger. "Watch closely. This is what happens when you respect the boundaries between life and death instead of trying to industrialize them." The well's blessed water surged upward, forming shapes that defied mortal comprehension. Each droplet contained reflected images of everyone who had ever served as guardian here. Native shamans, medieval priests, frontier preachers, and countless others whose names were lost to history but whose devotion still empowered this place. Kane's mechanical troops began to malfunction as sacred energy penetrated their modified weapons and armor. The alchemically treated steel of their equipment started to revert to its natural state, stripped of artificial enhancements by powers that demanded authenticity. But Kane himself proved more resilient. The brass plates in his face began to glow. As he activated backup systems, his mechanical augmentations were more extensive than anyone had realized. He had literally sold pieces of his humanity to the project in exchange for technological power. You think you're the only one who's spent years preparing? Kane's processed voice took on new harmonics as hidden machinery activated throughout his body. I've given everything to progress, made myself a living proof that science can improve upon divine design. The chamber trembled as Kane's full capabilities revealed themselves. His brass-plated form began to transform, expanding and shifting as hidden components deployed. He became a horrific fusion of man and machine, a mockery of sacred transformation, powered by stolen divine energy that his instruments had managed to capture and corrupt. Solomon stood his ground as Kane loomed over him, the sacred water still spiraling around them both. The final confrontation between ancient faith and corrupted science was about to begin, deep beneath a cemetery where the boundaries between natural and supernatural had always been thinnest. Above them, through the chamber's crystalline ceiling, they could see the battle between the grave-born guardians, and Blake's forces had reached a crescendo. But that conflict was merely an echo of the true war about to be fought, a war for the very soul of death itself. The harvest Solomon had spent 20 years preparing was finally ready. Now it was time to show Kane and the project why the founding families had chosen this particular spot to guard, and why some powers were never meant to be controlled, only respected. Judge Montgomery stepped forward, his aged hands holding an ancient text. Kane, you violated more than scientific ethics. Each soul you harvested was under divine protection. The founding families didn't just guard this ground. They maintained cosmic law. The judge began reading from the text in languages older than the territory itself. Each word seemed to peel back layers of Kane's mechanical transformation, revealing the corrupted spiritual architecture beneath. Every piece of divine essence you stole, Solomon explained, carried a price, not just in human suffering, but in universal balance. Death isn't meant to be industrialized because it's part of a greater cycle. Kane's crystal lenses whirred as they tried to analyze this new threat, but some truths couldn't be measured by mechanical means. The sacred water rising from the well began to resonate with Judge Montgomery's words, creating patterns that even Kane's advanced senses couldn't comprehend. The founding families understood, Dr. Wells added, her medical knowledge merging with spiritual insight. They didn't just protect the physical boundary between life and death, they maintained the metaphysical laws that govern both. The mechanical horse reared again, Harrison's spirit growing stronger as ancient truths were spoken aloud. Throughout Kane's transformed body, other trapped souls began to stir, fragments of divine essence responding to the chamber's awakening power. Your precious laws are obsolete. Kane's multi-layered voice held a note of desperation. Science has proven that even spiritual energy can be quantified, controlled, redirected. But his words rang hollow as more of Project Lazarus's victims made their presence known. Each soul fragment Kane had harvested contained not just energy, but memory, living records of the project's atrocities. But Solomon saw the price of that fusion written in Kane's few remaining organic features. The man's eyes, now multiplied, through crystalline arrays, held the haunted look of someone who'd glimpsed truths that mortal minds weren't meant to comprehend. Your soul, Solomon observed quietly. How much of it did you trade for this power? The question struck deeper than any bullet. Kane's mechanical form shuddered as buried memories surfaced. Souls are just energy patterns, he insisted, but static crackled through his voice. Quantifiable, measurable, harvestable. Dr. Wells decoded new meaning from her medical journals. The project didn't just experiment on bodies. They found ways to fragment the soul itself, trading pieces of divine essence for technological advancement. The mechanical horse bearing. Harrison's consciousness suddenly reared, smashing into Kane's transformed body. For a moment, the Colonel's tortured spirit recognized something of itself in Kane's corrupted state. Both men had sacrificed their humanity to the project's twisted vision of progress. Eleanor's music box began playing a darker melody, responding to the chamber's shifting energies. The sacred water from the well formed new patterns, revealing images of Project Lazarus's true experiments. They hadn't just reanimated corpses, they'd found ways to industrialize the very essence of life and death. The resonators, Madeline realized, studying her brother's maps with horror. They're not just sonic weapons, they're soul-harvesting devices, each frequency designed to shatter spirit from flesh. Kane's laughter echoed from multiple speakers as mechanical tendrils extended from his transformed body. Your brother was clever, girl, too clever. He discovered our collection methods, our storage facilities, entire warehouses filled with captured soul energy ready to power the next stage of human evolution. But Solomon saw something Kane's crystal lenses missed. The blessed water spiraling around them wasn't just reflecting light, it was reflecting truth. In its sacred depths, Kane's supposedly perfect form appeared as it truly was. A hollow shell powered by fragments of stolen divinity. You haven't evolved, Solomon declared, his silver cross pulsing with pure light. You've devolved, traded away everything that made you human for the illusion of power. The chamber's ancient runes began to glow as Solomon accessed deeper layers of its protection. Each symbol represented a different truth about death that the founding families had discovered. Not scientific principles to be exploited, but spiritual. Laws that demanded respect. Kane responded by pushing his transformed body to its limits. Brass pipes released corrupted steam as crystal lenses focused stolen divine energy into weapons. Your antiquated morality blinds you to the possibilities. Think of what humanity could achieve with industrialized immortality. But immortality, achieved through twisted science, carried a terrible price. The mechanical horse finally broke free of its containment circuits, and Harrison's tormented consciousness surged forth. Years of being used as a living battery had taught his spirit truths about death that Kane's instruments couldn't measure. "Show him," Solomon commanded softly. "Show him what the project really achieved." Harrison's spirit touched Kane's mechanized form, and suddenly the chamber was filled with voices, the souls of countless victims whose divine essence had been harvested for Project Lazarus. Their combined testimony painted a picture of industrial-scale spiritual torture, of sacred powers corrupted by men who thought death itself could be manufactured. Above them, through the crystal ceiling, they could see Blake's forces retreating from the Graveborn Guardians. But this surface victory meant little compared to the spiritual battle being waged in the chamber. Kane's transformation represented everything Solomon had spent 20 years protecting against. The arrogant belief that science could improve upon divine design. The harvest of 20 years' patience was about to bear its final fruit. Solomon. Gray hadn't just been maintaining the cemetery's physical defenses. He'd been strengthening the very boundaries between natural and supernatural law that Project Lazarus sought to break. As Kane's mechanized form reached for him with brass, tentacles and crystal lenses, Solomon prepared to show him why some boundaries should never be crossed, and why death itself demanded respect rather than industrialization. Petrov's scholarly expertise provided vital context as the chamber's true purpose revealed itself. The ancients believed in places of power, nexus points, where the barriers between worlds grew thin. But the founding families did more than find such a place. They built a machine to maintain cosmic equilibrium. The Russians' words gained weight as new symbols appeared in the sacred water's flow. Not just Christian crosses and Islamic crescents now, but older signs, Celtic spirals, Norse runes, Egyptian hieroglyphs, each representing a different culture's understanding of death's proper role in the universal order. Blake's demolition charges continued to backfire spectacularly above. Each explosion meant to destroy instead activated another portion of the vast geometric circuit. The entire cemetery was transforming, its true form emerging like a butterfly from a chrysalis of sacred stone. The graves themselves, Dr. Wells realized, her medical knowledge merging with metaphysical insight. They're not just resting places. They're components in a vast spiritual mechanism. Each burial adds its own energy to the system. Kane's mechanized form began to crack as the chamber's awakening power intensified. Through his crystal lenses, they could see the stolen divine essence trying to break free of its technological prison. Each soul fragment the project had harvested contained a spark of universal truth that no machine could fully contain. "Your brother saw it all," Solomon told Madeline, as more of Thomas's maps aligned with unfolding reality. He recognized that the project wasn't just violating individual souls. They were disrupting patterns woven into creation itself. The mechanical, horse-bearing Harrison's consciousness transformed as the chamber's power reached its peak. Its brass and steel components began to separate, allowing the colonel's tortured spirit to finally break free. But he wasn't alone. All the souls Kane had harvested were awakening, their combined energy adding to the cemetery's restoration of cosmic balance. But the project's attempt at demolition revealed something they hadn't anticipated. Each explosion exposed deeper layers of the cemetery's construction, unveiling a vast geometric pattern carved into the living rock itself. The founding families hadn't just built on this ground, they'd transformed the entire site into a massive spiritual circuit. The pattern, Madeline gasped, overlaying her brother's maps with the judge's ancient texts. It's not just for protection, it's a key to something bigger. Thomas discovered that the cemetery itself is a lock. Kane's mechanized form trembled as new understanding penetrated his crystal lenses. The brass pipes and steel conduits of his transformed body began to resonate with frequencies he couldn't control. All the divine essence he'd stolen, all the soul fragments he'd harvested, were responding to the cemetery's awakening power. Dr. Wells decoded the final entries in her medical journals. The project didn't just violate divine law. They created an imbalance in the cosmic order. Every soul they harvested, every death they industrialized, pushed the universe further toward chaos. Solomon's silver cross pulsed with pure light. As the truth emerged, the founding families chose this site because it sits at an intersection of spiritual ley lines. They built the cemetery as more than just a graveyard. It's a cosmic fulcrum. Through the shattered ceiling, they could see the graveborn guardians taking new forms. No longer just protectors of hallowed ground, they were becoming agents of universal balance. Each guardian represented a different aspect of death's true nature, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as part of a greater cycle. Eleanor's music. Vox began playing a melody that seemed to come from the dawn of time itself. The sacred water rising from the well formed patterns that mirrored the constellations above, revealing connections between heavenly and earthly order that the project had arrogantly ignored. "You fools," Kane's multi-layered voice held genuine. "Fear now. Do you realize what you're doing? The energy we harvested, it can't just be released. The consequences of your hubris end today," Judge Montgomery declared, reading from texts that grew older with each page. "Turn." The ancient languages he spoke weren't just words. They were keys, unlocking the cemetery's final purpose. Above them, Blake's forces encountered a new kind of resistance. The demolition charges they'd set began to transform. Their explosive, energy absorbed and redirected by the cemetery's geometric patterns. Each blast, meant to destroy, instead strengthened the site's spiritual foundations. Harrison's spirit, still partly bound to the mechanical horse, suddenly surged with new purpose. All the souls trapped in Cain's brass and steel prison began to resonate with the chamber's awakening power. They weren't just victims anymore. They were witnesses to universal law reasserting itself. The project's fundamental error, Solomon explained as divine light filled the chamber, wasn't just in trying to industrialize death. You tried to break the cycle itself, to create a technological immortality that violated cosmic order. The sacred water swirling around them formed new patterns, revealing truths that Cain's instruments couldn't quantify. Each soul the project had harvested was connected to something larger, a grand design that demanded balance between life and death, natural and supernatural, physical and spiritual. Through the crystal lenses of his mechanized form, Cain watched in horror as his life's work began to unravel. All the stolen divine essence, all the corrupted sacred power was being drawn into the cemetery's vast geometric circuit, the founding. Families hadn't just built a graveyard, they'd created a mechanism for restoring universal equilibrium. You can't stop progress. Cain's desperate voice echoed from multiple speakers. Humanity needs what we discovered, the power to transcend death itself. But Solomon Gray, the man who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, understood something Cain never could. True power didn't come from breaking cosmic laws, it came from maintaining them. The harvest he'd cultivated wasn't just evidence against Project Lazarus. It was nothing less than the restoration of death's proper place in the universal order. Through the shattered ceiling, the night sky revealed itself as more than just stars. Ancient constellations aligned with the cemetery's geometric patterns, creating channels of power that the founding families had mapped centuries ago. The entire site wasn't just built on a nexus of spiritual energy. It was designed to harness cosmic forces for maintaining universal law. Eleanor's music box began playing impossible harmonies as more of the chamber's secrets emerged. Each note corresponded to a different aspect of death's true nature: transition, transformation, renewal. The box wasn't just controlling the cemetery's defenses, it was conducting a symphony of cosmic realignment. The project's experiments, Judge Montgomery realized, studying symbols that predated written history, didn't just violate individual souls. They created fractures in reality itself. Each industrial resurrection, each mechanized spirit, widened. Those cracks, Cain's transformed body shuddered as this truth penetrated his crystal lenses. The brass pipes and steel conduits that channeled stolen divine energy began to resonate with frequencies beyond scientific measurement. All his carefully calibrated instruments were detecting something his corrupted science couldn't explain: the universe fighting back against violation of its fundamental laws. Your progress was regression, Solomon declared as the sacred water formed new patterns. Each step forward in your technological necromancy pushes humanity further from its proper place in the cosmic order. The founding families didn't just protect the dead, they maintained the boundaries between life and death that keep reality itself stable. The chamber's awakening power reached a crescendo as stars aligned overhead. Through the geometric circuit, carved into living rock, through graves that served as components in a vast spiritual machine. Through the combined faith of countless guardians across centuries, universal balance began to reassert itself. The cemetery's transformation reached its apex as ancient stars aligned with earthly geometry. Each grave became a conductor in a vast metaphysical circuit, channeling power that existed before humanity first contemplated death's mysteries. The founding families hadn't just built defenses, they'd created an instrument for playing cosmic harmonies. Cain's mechanized form fought against the chamber's awakening power, his crystal lenses cracking as they tried to analyze forces beyond scientific measurement. The brass pipes and steel conduits of his transformed body began to resonate with frequencies that threatened to tear his technological shell apart. "The balance must be restored," Judge Montgomery intoned, reading from texts whose pages seemed to turn themselves. Each soul returned to its proper place in the great cycle, each death honored rather than industrialized. Through the cemetery's crystalline foundations, they could see Blake's forces encountering a new kind of resistance. The Graveborn Guardians had taken forms that represented death's true aspects: transition, renewal, judgment. Not enemies to be conquered, but natural forces demanding respect. "You don't understand what you're unleashing." Kane's multi-layered voice held genuine terror now. "The project didn't just harvest souls. We modified the boundaries between life and death themselves. If those changes are suddenly reversed, the price must be paid," Solomon replied, his silver cross pulsing with pure light. "Every natural law you violated, every cosmic boundary you broke, the universe demands balance." Dr. Wells's medical journals revealed the full horror of Project Lazarus's experimentation. "They didn't just resurrect the dead," she explained. "They tried to industrialize the very process of death itself, create an assembly line for manufacturing immortality." The sacred water rising from the chamber's central well formed new patterns, revealing the project's true impact on reality. Each industrial resurrection had created fractures in the cosmic order. Each mechanized spirit had widened cracks in the foundation of existence itself. Eleanor's music box played impossible harmonies as the chamber's power reached its peak. The tune wasn't controlling the cemetery's defenses anymore. It was conducting a symphony of universal realignment, natural law reasserting itself against technological violation. Kane's transformed body began to disintegrate as stolen divine essence fought for freedom. The souls he'd harvested, fragments of spiritual energy he'd trapped in brass and steel, were responding to the cemetery's awakening power. Each one contained a spark of universal truth that no machine could permanently contain. "Your progress was an illusion," Solomon declared as divine light filled the chamber. "Every step forward in your technological necromancy pushed humanity further from its proper place in the cosmic order. The founding families understood what you forgot. Death isn't an enemy to be conquered, but a doorway to be respected." The tight, mechanical horse that had imprisoned Harrison's consciousness finally shattered, releasing not just the Colonel's tortured spirit, but all the souls Kane had used to power his twisted experiments. They rose like a luminous tide, each one carrying memories of the project's atrocities. Through the chamber's crystal ceiling, they could see stars wheeling in patterns that hadn't been witnessed since the founding families first consecrated this ground. The entire cemetery was becoming a lens, focusing cosmic energy into the task of restoring universal balance. But Kane had one final card to play. His mechanized form began to pulse with corrupted power as hidden reservoirs of harvested soul energy activated. The brass plates and crystal lenses of his transformed body channeled stolen divinity in ways that threatened to shatter reality itself. "If I can't have this power," his processed voice resonated from multiple speakers, "then I'll ensure no one can. The project's work will not be undone." The chamber trembled as Kane pushed his technological abominations to their limits. Sacred. Water recoiled from waves of corrupted energy as his desperate gambit threatened to tear apart the very fabric of existence. The boundary between life and death, already weakened by Project Lazarus's experiments, began to buckle under the strain. Solomon Gray stood at the edge of the central well, 20 years of preparation leading to this moment. His silver cross had become more than a symbol. It was a key forged from the combined faith of all who had guarded this ground. The time had come to show Kane why some powers were never meant to be controlled, only respected. As Kane channeled, His stolen power, reality itself, began to warp around his mechanized form. The brass plates of his body split open, revealing crystalline chambers filled with trapped souls, each one a battery of divine energy forced to power his corrupted technology. "Behold the true face of progress," Kane's voice distorted through shattered speakers. "Every soul we harvested, every death we industrialized, added to this moment. If the universe demands balance, then let it witness perfect chaos." The chamber's sacred architecture groaned under the strain as Kane unleashed forces that threatened to tear apart the veil between life and death. Through fracturing crystal lenses, they could see the boundaries of existence starting to dissolve. "The resonance patterns," Dr. Wells shouted over the metaphysical cacophony. "He's not just using the souls for power, he's forcing them to vibrate at frequencies that disrupt natural law itself." Judge Montgomery's ancient texts began to smoke as reality warped around them. The founding families foresaw this possibility, he revealed, a force that could corrupt death's true purpose, turning the doorway between worlds into a weapon. Eleanor's music box struggled against Kane's discord, its pure harmonies fighting to maintain cosmic order. But the box wasn't just playing music anymore. It was trying to preserve the fundamental rhythms that kept existence stable. Madeline discovered new markings on her brother's map as reality buckled around them. The cemetery's layout, she realized, it's not just a spiritual circuit, it's a containment system. The founding families built it to prevent exactly this kind of cosmic rupture. The sacred water from the central well formed barriers against Kane's assault, each droplet containing centuries of accumulated prayers and protection. But his corrupted technology was forcing open doorways that were never meant to be breached. Through the crystalline foundations, they watched Blake's forces retreat in terror as the consequences of Kane's actions manifested. The Graveborn Guardians were changing, their forms shifting between states of existence as reality's fabric began to tear. The project's true goal, Solomon revealed as he channeled power through his silver cross. They didn't just want to control death, they wanted to remake the fundamental laws of existence, create a world where their technology could override divine will itself. Kane's mechanized body continued its horrific transformation, each layer of brass and steel peeling back to reveal new abominations. The souls he'd harvested weren't just powering his systems now, they were being consumed, their divine essence, converted into pure chaos. "You think your ancient protections can stop this?" Kane's fractured voice boomed. "I've transcended your primitive concepts of natural law. When I'm finished, death itself will bow to the will of progress." But even as Kane's power reached its peak, Solomon saw what the corrupted scientist had missed. The founding families hadn't just built defenses against chaos. They'd created a system for channeling and redirecting forces that threatened cosmic balance. Every grave, every monument, every blessed stone was part of a vast machine designed to restore universal order. The harvest of 20 years' patience was about to bear its final, terrible fruit. Solomon Gray prepared to show Kane why the powers of death demanded respect rather than domination, and why some boundaries were never meant to be broken. Solomon stepped forward, his silver cross glowing brighter than ever, its light cutting through the chaos like a beacon. The sacred water from the central well surged upward in response, cascading in a vortex of purity, surrounding Kane's mechanical form and halting his destructive push forward. It was as if the very essence of life and death was rallying against the unnatural force he had created. Kane's body, already frayed and falling apart under the pressure of his own defiance, let out a final, defiant roar. "You can't stop me," he spat, his voice a mixture of rage and terror. "All that you've done, all that you've sacrificed, it's meaningless. Progress will survive. You're nothing but a relic of an old world that's already gone." But Solomon's calm demeanor never wavered. He knew what needed to be done. He raised his silver cross high, its glow now blinding, and spoke the ancient words inscribed in the oldest of the texts. The language was primal, older than any human tongue, reverberating through the air and shaking the very ground beneath. Them, you sought to dominate death, Cain. But death is not to be mastered, it is to be honored. Balance is the law of existence. Every step you take to break it only brings you closer to your own undoing. As he spoke, the sacred water flowed into the veins of the cemetery's stonework, connecting with every grave, every monument, every etched symbol. The foundations of the cemetery hummed with power, the ancestral protection of the founding families. Now fully awakened, the geometric lines beneath their feet, once dormant, now activated as though they were the very heartbeats of the earth itself, pulsing in time with the stars above. Cain's mechanical form convulsed, the crystalline lenses of his body shattering under the force of the cosmic energy now bearing down on him. The souls he had captured, once trapped within the cold embrace of technology, began to vibrate with an energy not of this world. They were no longer passive victims, but active participants in the ritual that would restore the order Cain had. Shattered. "No!" Cain screamed, his voice fractured as if the very fabric of his being was being torn apart. "I will not be undone by the likes of you. My work is necessary. You don't understand." But Solomon understood better than anyone. He had seen the truth through decades of preparation, through every whispered warning from the guardians and every prayer left behind by the founding families. The true power lay not in control, but in balance, in respect for the natural flow of life and death. The cemetery, now fully alive with cosmic power, surged into motion. The barriers Cain had forced open began to close, one by one, as though reality itself was righting the terrible wrongs he had set in motion. The brass pipes and steel frames of Cain's body melted away, consumed by the energy of the souls he had tried to use. The mechanized abomination he had become began to collapse, piece by piece, the souls trapped within him escaping, their divine essence once again free to return to the cycle. The last of Cain's resistance faltered. His body, now nothing more than twisted remnants of brass, steel, and shattered glass, fell to the ground with a thundering crash. The cosmic forces that had once bent to his will now turned against him, dragging him into the very void he had tried to control. The energy around them began to settle, the balance restored. In the silence that followed, the stars above shimmered like ancient eyes watching over the land. The cemetery had completed its purpose, not just as a resting place for the dead, but as the eternal guardian of the balance between life and death. Solomon lowered his silver cross, the light fading, but the peace it left behind remained. He turned to the others, his voice steady. "It is done. Cain's work is undone. The balance is restored." Eleanor's music box, which had been playing the impossible harmonies, now faded into a gentle, peaceful lullaby. The grave-born guardians, once fierce and threatening, had returned to their original forms. Spirits of transition, transformation, and renewal, watching over the graves as they had for centuries. Blake's forces, witnessing the fall of Cain and the restoration of the cemetery, had already begun retreating, their morale shattered. The survivors could only look back at the wreckage of what was once a powerful, terrifying force, and know that they had been a part of something far greater than themselves, something that transcended their understanding. Dr. Wells, eyes wide, with disbelief at the power they had just witnessed, approached Solomon. "You were right all along," she whispered. "The project, it was never about resurrection, was it? It was about control. Control over death, control over nature itself, and in trying to force it, they broke everything." Solomon nodded solemnly. The harvest of souls is not for men to claim, and death is not ours to conquer. What they sought to manipulate was the very force that keeps the universe in balance. By defying it, they brought chaos. The ground beneath them rumbled lightly, but not with the ominous dread they had come to expect. It was a reverberation of the earth itself, settling back into harmony. The cosmic rhythms realigned after a long disruption. Harrison, his spirit now free from the mechanical prison, walked slowly toward the group. His eyes, once filled with torment, were now clear. "We've seen what happens when humanity reaches too far," he said quietly. "But maybe we've learned. Maybe we can honor death instead of trying to escape it." Solomon turned to him with a grim smile. "Let this be a lesson for all of us. Some things, like life and death, must be left in their proper place." As the group stood in the center of the cemetery, the stars overhead were no longer an ancient mystery, but a reminder of the universal balance they had just fought to restore. The final echoes of Cain's ambition were swallowed by the winds of change, and the cemetery, now once again a sacred space, stood as a silent guardian over the great cycle of life and death. And in the distance, they could see the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, signaling a new beginning. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon, the cemetery's once shadowed tombstones seemed to breathe, their stones now illuminated by a golden glow. The oppressive air that had lingered during the battle with Cain began to dissipate, replaced by a serene quiet that felt almost sacred. The graveyard, a site of death, had been transformed into something more, a place where life and death intertwined, where the forces of nature had been restored to their rightful balance. For the first time in years, the weight of constant dread was lifted from Solomon's shoulders. His heart, once burdened by the ghosts of past mistakes and the looming specter of Cain's twisted ambitions, felt lighter. The darkness that had loomed over his work was gone. He had succeeded, but at a cost. He knew the battle had only been one chapter in a much larger story. The forces that tried to tamper with the laws of the universe were not so easily forgotten. "You did it," Dr. Wells said, her voice filled with awe as she looked around at the peaceful dawn. "You really did it." Solomon nodded, but there was a heaviness in his expression. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us, the founding families, the guardians, the spirits of this place. We've all played a part in making sure the balance was restored." He turned to look at the massive celestial alignment, still visible in the sky, the constellations now dimming as the daylight grew stronger. The cosmic patterns that had once guided the forces of the cemetery were beginning to fade, their purpose fulfilled, but Solomon knew it was far from over. What they had done was vital, but the cosmic forces were not static. They were in constant motion, ever-changing. The balance could shift again. "We can't allow this to be forgotten," Solomon murmured. "The temptation to reach beyond what is natural, it's not gone. As long as men try to bend the laws of the universe to their will, this will be an ongoing fight." Eleanor, who had been quietly holding her music box, her eyes cast downward, spoke softly. "Then we protect it. We keep this place safe. Guard the knowledge, the power of what we've learned. We make sure no one ever tries to break the cycle again." Solomon's gaze softened as he looked at her. The music box had played a pivotal role in guiding the cemetery's transformation, its impossible melodies in tune with the natural rhythms of the universe. It wasn't just an object. It was a conduit of cosmic harmony, a symbol of the delicate balance they had just fought to preserve. Harrison stepped forward, now fully unshackled from his mechanical prison. His body still bore the scars of Cain's experiments, but his spirit was free. "I understand now. My journey, my suffering, it wasn't in vain. I fought against death, and in doing so, I lost everything. What Cain did was wrong, but he wasn't. The only one. We all have to learn to let go. The others nodded, the weight of Harrison's words settling deep within them. They had all come so close to losing sight of the true meaning of life and death. In their own ways, each of them had sought to control or deny the inevitable. But through the cemetery's awakening, they had seen the deeper truth. Life and death were not enemies to conquer. They were part of a grand cycle, one that should be respected, not exploited. Dr. Wells was already looking ahead, her mind racing. We'll need to document everything. The cemetery, the symbols, the technology Kane used. There's knowledge here we can't afford to lose. We may not be able to replicate what was done, but we can preserve the lessons. Solomon agreed. The founding families left us a legacy, a blueprint for maintaining balance. We must protect it, and we must ensure it remains hidden from those who would seek to pervert it. As the group stood in the center of the cemetery, the weight of their victory began to sink in. They had overcome an unimaginable force, but their work was far from finished. They would need to guard this place, the truth of what had occurred, and the power of what had been awakened. For there would always be others like Cain, others who sought to rewrite the laws of nature for their own gain. Yet, as the sunlight broke over the horizon, the cemetery itself seemed to stand in quiet defiance, a testament to what had been preserved. The earth beneath them thrummed with a quiet pulse, and the graves, once cold and empty, now seemed to hum with a new energy. The boundary between life and death had been restored, but it had also been deepened, made stronger by the cosmic forces that had been woven back into place. Eleanor's music box continued to play, the notes now soft and comforting, like the lullaby of a world that had found its peace once more. The stars, once so ominous, were now gently retreating into the vast expanse of the sky, as if giving their final blessing to the victory that had been achieved. "I think we've earned our rest," Solomon said, his voice calm but resolute. "But we'll stay vigilant. The work is not done. We must protect the balance, as the founding families did before us." And so they began to make their way from the heart of the cemetery, the ancient walls and markers standing strong in their purpose. The journey was far from over, but the lessons learned in the battle against Cain would carry them forward. For now, the cemetery was at peace, but the watchful eyes of the universe never truly closed, and the cycle would continue. As the group slowly made their way out of the cemetery, the quiet hum of cosmic energy still vibrated faintly beneath their feet. The air was different now, lighter, as though the world itself had exhaled, releasing the weight that had burdened it for so long. The morning sun shone brighter, but there was something solemn in its warmth. The battle had been won, but the scars of the struggle were still fresh in their minds, each of them marked by the experience in ways that would never fully fade. Solomon paused at the entrance, turning back to look at the cemetery one last time. He stood still for a long moment, a sense of finality settling over him. This place was more than just a battleground. It was a living entity, a guardian of the balance between life and death. And though the cosmic forces had been reasserted, he knew it wasn't just the cemetery that needed protection, it was the truth itself, the knowledge, the understanding, the ancient laws that governed the universe. Those were fragile, and they needed to be kept safe from those who would seek to twist them once again. "We can't let anyone find out about the true nature of this place," Solomon said, his voice resolute. "What Cain wanted was to weaponize death, but there are others who might try to do the same, others who would misuse the power of this site." Dr. Wells nodded thoughtfully. "Agreed, but we also need to preserve the information for future generations in case something like this ever happens again. We can't just erase it. This knowledge is too important." Madeline stepped forward, holding her brother's map, the very map that had guided them to this place. "I'll make sure we document everything," she said, her voice steady with resolve. "We won't make the same mistakes Cain did. We'll keep the truth hidden, but we'll record it. Maybe one day, when the time is right, the next generation will be ready to understand it." Harrison, still adjusting to his newfound freedom, glanced around at the others. "And we'll keep watch. This place isn't just a cemetery, it's a key to the universe. We've seen what happens when that key is misused." Eleanor, still holding the music box, added softly, "It's more than just knowledge, it's a responsibility. We were chosen to be part of this. We can't just walk away." Solomon nodded. "Exactly. We have to protect it, not just from those who seek to corrupt it, but from anyone who might forget why it exists in the first place. Death isn't something to control. It's a part of the natural order." The group continued on, walking away from the cemetery and toward the world outside. They could feel the weight of their mission heavy upon them, but it wasn't just the knowledge of what they had experienced that hung in the air. It was the bond they had formed, the understanding that they were now stewards of something far greater than themselves. As they walked, they noticed the air growing warmer, the shadows stretching longer as the day moved forward. The world around them seemed to be coming alive once more, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the birds chirping in the distance. Life in all its forms was returning to normal, but beneath the surface there was a shift, a quiet understanding that things would never be the same again. As the group reached the edge of the cemetery, Solomon stopped once more. He turned back to face the others. "We can't let the world know about what happened here, not yet at least. People wouldn't understand, and they'd either exploit or destroy it. It has to remain hidden, as it was meant to be. But we have. To ensure its protection, we'll keep the truth safe, and when the time is right, we'll pass it on." Eleanor, her eyes distant but determined, spoke quietly. "We'll need to build a new kind of order, one that honors the cycle. Maybe we can start a new legacy, one that teaches respect for death rather than fear or control." The others nodded in agreement, the weight of the task ahead settling in. It wouldn't be easy. There would be those who would seek to tear down what they were trying to build, and those who would never understand the gravity of the responsibility they now carried. But it was a responsibility they accepted, one they would face together. Solomon looked around at his companions, the people who had fought beside him, who had stood against an impossible force and emerged victorious. "Whatever happens, we'll stand together. We are the guardians now, and we must remain vigilant. The cemetery has been restored, but the work we've begun, it has only just started." With that, they turned and walked into the future, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had fought for and the burden of protecting the balance that had been so nearly lost. Behind them, the cemetery stood silent, its purpose fulfilled, for now. The grave markers, etched with symbols older than time itself, remained quiet sentinels, guarding the delicate boundary between life and death. The stars above, having witnessed the cosmic struggle unfold, returned to their eternal watch, their distant lights flickering softly as if in approval. But the universe, vast and infinite, had many mysteries yet to reveal, and the battle for balance was never truly over. In the quiet depths of space and time, the forces of chaos and order would continue to ebb and flow, forever locked in their ancient dance. And though the cemetery had won its most crucial battle, its guardians knew that the true test would be ensuring that the harmony they had restored remained undisturbed, for the universe was alive, and it would never stop testing those who sought to bend its laws to their will. And they, Solomon, Eleanor, Madeline, Harrison, and the rest, would be there, standing guard, ready to defend it. Always. The journey back to the world outside the cemetery was long and quiet. The group walked in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the enormity of what had just transpired weighing heavily on their minds. The sun was higher now, casting a warm golden light across the landscape, but it felt like a world that had been irrevocably changed. They had returned from the edge of existence itself, where the balance between life and death had been so tenuously held, and they knew that they couldn't unsee what they had witnessed. As they reached the road that led away from the cemetery, Solomon turned to face them all one last time. The moment of peace they had felt standing in the cemetery's heart was fleeting. Now, the gravity of the responsibility they carried seemed to settle back onto their shoulders. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice grave. "We may have restored the balance, but we've only just begun to understand the full scope of what Cain was trying to do. The universe won't forget what happened here, and neither can we." Madeline stepped forward, her eyes sharp with determination. "We've seen the consequences of breaking natural law, but there are others who won't learn from Cain's mistakes. They'll try again. We have to be ready." Dr. Wells, who had been mostly quiet up until now, adjusted her glasses, the edges of her mouth curling into a faint, knowing smile. "You're right. There's a world of knowledge here, and there are plenty of people who would want to abuse it. They'll seek us out, or worse, they'll try to repeat what Cain did. This isn't something we can simply walk away from." Eleanor nodded, her fingers still gently caressing the music box in her hands. The melodies that had once seemed so haunting now felt comforting, like a thread tying her to something greater than herself. The music! It was more than just a tool. It was a signal, a connection to something far beyond us. "I think it's telling us that we're not just guardians of this place. We're custodians of a much larger ancient truth." Harrison, his face now more peaceful than it had been in years, looked up at the sky. His mechanical body, now mostly free of the torment Cain had inflicted upon him, still bore the marks of that long imprisonment. Yet his eyes seemed clearer than they had ever been. "This place, it's alive. It's like a living, breathing organism that knows its purpose. It might seem like a graveyard to most, but it's something else entirely. We can't let the world forget that." Solomon turned toward the distant horizon, where the world beyond the cemetery lay. It was a world full of endless possibilities, but also endless dangers. The knowledge they now held could save lives or doom them. The task ahead wasn't just about protecting the cemetery. It was about ensuring that the balance they had restored could never again be tipped, that the forces Cain had awakened could never spiral out of control again. "We'll have to split up," Solomon said, breaking the silence. "We'll need to create a network, a hidden one. We can't protect knowledge alone. We need to find others who understand the importance of keeping the balance, those who can fight the temptations of power." He looked at each of them, as if seeing them for the first time. They had all been chosen, whether by fate or by design, to bear this weight. "We can't risk repeating what Cain did, and we can't allow anyone else to make the same mistakes." The group nodded in unison. They all understood. The decision had been made, and though they each had their doubts, their purpose was clear. They were more than just survivors of a cataclysmic struggle. They were now the protectors of an ancient truth that could either save or destroy the very fabric of existence. As they began to move toward their separate paths, Solomon gave one last look at the cemetery. It stood as it always had, quiet and resolute, its purpose fulfilled for now. The world outside would continue, and the forces of nature would shift and change, but as long as the cemetery remained undisturbed, its secrets would be safe. The balance would hold. And then, as if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled slightly, a faint vibration that seemed to echo through the air. It was so subtle, so delicate, that if they weren't paying attention, they might have missed it entirely. But they weren't just people. They were now the guardians of a force older than any of them could understand. They felt it, The cemetery was alive, it was breathing, and it was watching over them. Solomon paused, turning back to the others. The cemetery's energy, it's still shifting. It's not done. The universe has its own rhythm, its own way of maintaining balance, and sometimes it sends us a reminder. Eleanor, her music box still in hand, nodded. A reminder that we're not alone in this, that we're part of something bigger. Dr. Wells, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. A reminder or a warning? Maybe both, Solomon said, his voice thoughtful, but either way we'll be ready. The group exchanged a final look, and then they turned toward the world that lay before them. Their mission was only just beginning, and the dangers that awaited them were still unknown. But for the first time, they felt a sense of purpose, a shared understanding that their place in this vast universe was more than mere accident. It was fate, and it had chosen them to carry the burden of protecting the cosmic order. As they disappeared into the distance, the cemetery behind them seemed to settle, its ancient energies still pulsing beneath the earth. The stars above blinked one last time, their distant light casting long shadows across the land. And the world, for all its chaos and unpredictability, felt just a little bit more balanced than it had before. But the universe, as it always had, would continue to test them, and they would be ready. The days that followed were quiet, but the quiet was heavy. The team, though separated by miles now, remained bound by a shared understanding, an unspoken commitment to guard the knowledge and the power they had uncovered. Solomon knew they couldn't be together all the time, but they couldn't afford to forget the cemetery either. He had always felt like a man out of place in the world, a man who carried burdens no one else could understand. Now, more than ever, that feeling was intensified. There was something ancient and otherworldly in his bones, a knowledge passed down from the founding families, perhaps, or the very land itself. The cemetery had awakened a part of him he hadn't known existed. Each night he would walk in his garden, the silver cross still warm in his hand, the familiar weight of it, a reminder that he wasn't alone. But that same reminder carried with it an unshakable truth. He had seen what humanity was capable of. He'd witnessed what happened when technology and ambition tried to conquer death, and he knew there were those who would never stop trying to control what wasn't meant to be controlled. The others were scattered too, but their paths weren't as lonely. Madeline, after spending hours in her brother's study, poring over the maps and records, had begun to gather a team. She was no longer the curious, uncertain researcher she had been before. She was now a strategist, carefully selecting individuals who could guard the knowledge of the cemetery and its immense power. She would never forget the look in Harrison's eyes, the clarity that had come to him the moment he'd been freed from Cain's curse. The man who had been enslaved by his own creation was now more than a survivor. He was a warrior, one who had been forged in the crucible of that very hell. Madeline had a plan, a network. Like the cemetery itself, it had to be interconnected, hidden in plain sight. She knew they needed to protect the secrets, but also to keep them alive. There were ancient texts scattered throughout the world that needed to be safeguarded. A new kind of brotherhood that would watch over the cosmic balance. They couldn't let history repeat itself. The forces that had been set into motion by Project Lazarus could not be undone, but they could be controlled. She began reaching out to other scholars, mystics, and even governments, laying the foundation for a clandestine order that would keep the knowledge safe and keep the world unaware of the forces that moved beneath the surface. Harrison, for his part, had taken up the mantle of protector in a different way. The experiences of his tortured soul, both as a man and as a prisoner to technology, had transformed him. The mechanical parts that once confined him to a world of pain and disconnection now represented his strength. He took to the road, traveling from town to town, seeking those whose understanding of the metaphysical might be more advanced. He met with individuals who had dabbled in ancient rituals, with shamans who knew the whispers of the earth, and with spiritual leaders who had seen things far beyond the veil of human understanding. Each time, he would tell them a small part of the story, enough to see if they truly understood the forces at play, enough to test whether they could be trusted. Eleanor, ever the quiet observer, had become something of a wanderer. The music box, which had once been nothing more than a tool, was now part of her in a way that felt inexplicably deep. She couldn't fully explain it, but the box seemed to hum with its own energy, as if it were a living thing, a sentient force, that responded to her. She spent her nights composing new melodies, and when she did, it was as though the universe bent slightly in response. The harmonies that filled the air were soothing, but also unsettling. They echoed the cemetery's sacred rhythm, as if the music had its own role to play in maintaining the cosmic balance. The music became her way of connecting with the divine energy she had felt in the chamber, an energy that was still swirling within her, pushing her toward a destiny she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Back at the cemetery, the sacred water that had once been their guide still rippled softly beneath the surface, though its activity had slowed. The stars above still twinkled with a purpose, aligned with the geometric patterns of the ground below. There was a deep, profound sense of peace that surrounded the site, something that hadn't been present in the years before, when Cain had corrupted the land with his twisted experiments. But it was a peace that couldn't last forever. The forces they had awakened were too powerful, and the knowledge of the cemetery too dangerous to remain in the shadows. One night, months after the events that had changed their lives, Solomon stood on a hill overlooking the cemetery, his breath misting in the crisp air. He felt the subtle hum of energy beneath his feet again, the familiar vibration of power calling to him. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. The balance had been restored, yes, but the work was far from over. The world had already begun to change. He pulled the silver cross from his pocket and held it high, its surface gleaming in the moonlight. "We've done what we could," he whispered to the wind, as though the cemetery itself might hear him. "But there's more to come." Behind him, the first signs of movement appeared, a shadow among the trees, a figure walking toward him with purpose. Solomon's heart skipped a beat. The time had come for them to confront the consequences of their actions. The silence that had settled over the world since their victory was deceptive. As much as they had restored balance, something, somewhere, was beginning to stir once again. The figure approached, stepping into the light. It was a familiar face, one that Solomon had feared he would see again, though he'd hoped it wouldn't be so soon. "Cain's work is far from finished," the figure said, their voice dark and unmistakable. "You've only delayed the inevitable. And now, the true test begins." Solomon's grip tightened on the cross. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice calm but laced with authority. The figure smiled, a knowing, almost cruel smile. "I am the one who will see the legacy of Cain fulfilled." The cemetery, silent but ever watchful, seemed to pulse in response. The stars above flickered, and in that moment Solomon knew this was only the beginning. The figure stepped closer, their presence unsettling in the way that only someone who had lived on the fringe of darkness could be. Solomon could feel the familiar, tingling hum of energy coursing beneath the earth, but now it felt different, darker, more uncertain, as if the balance they had fought so hard to restore was once again being threatened. "You think you've won," the figure said, their voice a low whisper, as if the night itself was trying to speak. "But the power you've buried here, it never truly disappears. You've just hidden it. And that, Solomon, is the mistake most make." Solomon's hand gripped the silver cross tighter, the cool metal pressing into his palm. He had known this. was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud was a different kind of weight. His gaze sharpened, trying to pierce the shadowy figure's true intentions. "Who are you?" he repeated, more forcefully this time, his patience thinning. "What do you want?" The figure stepped into the moonlight, revealing their face, a face Solomon didn't recognize, but one that seemed strangely familiar, like a memory he couldn't quite reach. Their eyes gleamed with a cold certainty, eyes that knew things Solomon didn't want to know. "That's a question you should already know the answer to," they replied, a cruel smile curling their lips. "I'm not the first to try and control what should remain beyond human reach, but I will be the last." A cold chill ran down Solomon's spine. The implications of the figure's words were clear. The true threat had never left. It had just been lying in wait, hidden beneath the layers of the universe's natural order. "I was part of the project," the figure confessed, their tone laced with both pride and madness. "But unlike Cain, I see what he missed. I understand that the power you've guarded here is not a thing to fear. No, it is something to control. The universe is not a perfect system, Solomon. It's chaos masquerading as order. What you fought so hard to protect is nothing but an illusion." Solomon's mind raced. They were speaking of Project Lazarus, the work Cain had started, the twisted experiments that sought to bridge the realms of life and death, to transcend natural law itself. But this person, whoever they were, had somehow escaped the notice of the others. They had been lurking in the shadows, watching, learning, waiting. The figure continued, their voice growing more forceful, more certain. "I am the one who will take Cain's work to its true conclusion. You think death is sacred, that it must remain untouched, that balance must never be broken. But the truth is, Solomon, it is broken already. All you've done is delay the inevitable. I will finish what was started." The figure raised their hand, and Solomon felt the air around him vibrate with a strange, unnatural force. The energy of the cemetery, the very land beneath his feet, seemed to shift, distort, as though reality itself was stretching and warping in response to their presence. "You've spent your life guarding this place," the figure taunted. "But what if I told you that the key to breaking the boundaries between life and death is in your own blood?" Solomon took a step back, his mind reeling. The figure's words were too dangerous, too full of dark promise. The key in his blood? What did they mean? Before he could formulate a response, the figure snapped their fingers. The ground beneath Solomon's feet trembled, and for a moment the air grew impossibly still. A low hum began to fill the air, like the sound of 1,000 voices whispering from beneath the earth. The cemetery, so peaceful just moments before, now felt as though it was being pulled in different directions. The stars above flickered, and the geometric patterns embedded in the earth seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. The figure smirked, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You're too late. You've tried to preserve balance, but the flow of time is a current that cannot be stopped. I will walk the path Cain never could, the path of true immortality." Solomon's pulse quickened. He knew now their presence wasn't just a threat to the cemetery. It wasn't just about Cain's work anymore. This was about something far worse. If this figure could truly manipulate the very forces of life and death, if they could control the cosmic energies bound within the cemetery, the consequences would be catastrophic. And then, as though to confirm his darkest fears, the ground shook again, this time more violently. The barrier between the physical and the spiritual realms began to crack open. From beneath the earth, a deep, resonant growl echoed upward, a sound of something ancient, restless and angry, as if the cemetery itself were awakening to the threat. "That sound," Solomon murmured, his eyes widening. "It's not just a reaction to you. It's the balance fighting back, The figure tilted their head, unfazed. Do you honestly think that old protections can stop progress? No, Solomon. They were never meant to last forever. I will see the world remade. I will remake it in my image. Solomon's mind flashed back to the ancient texts he had studied for years, the ones that spoke of the powers beneath the cemetery, the energies that had been harnessed to protect the world. He realized now that he hadn't understood the full scope of that power. It was not just a defense, it was a living force, one that required careful guardianship. But now, it was being manipulated, and the figure before him knew how to exploit. The figure stepped closer, their shadows stretching like fingers towards Solomon. You failed to see the bigger picture, they whispered, their breath cold on Solomon's skin. Cain failed, but I won't. I will unlock the door to immortality, and when I do, I will remake death itself. No more boundaries, no more restrictions, only power. For the first time in years, Solomon felt the weight of his years of preparation crashing down on him. He had thought himself ready, but facing this new enemy, this new threat, it was clear that everything was about to change. He gripped the silver cross tighter, its light growing brighter in his hands. You underestimate the forces you're playing with, he said, his voice low but resolute. The balance doesn't just protect life and death, it protects the fabric of reality itself. If you break that, there will be nothing left, not even you. The figure laughed darkly. We'll see about that. And with a final, deliberate movement, they raised their hands toward the sky. The stars above seemed to shimmer violently as a rift opened in the heavens, a crack in the very fabric of the universe. Solomon's heart pounded as the ground beneath him quaked once more. The battle was no longer just for the cemetery, it was for the very soul of the world. And Solomon knew one thing: the fight for the balance of life and death had just begun. The rift in the sky grew wider, the tear in the fabric of reality expanding like a gaping wound. The very air seemed to hum with a foreboding energy, and the ground beneath Solomon's feet trembled in sync with the growing rift. The stars above flickered in unnatural patterns, as though the heavens themselves were being pulled apart, piece by piece. The figure, whose face still felt like a distant memory, yet was so painfully unfamiliar, smiled cruelly, their outstretched hands now gathering the power of the rift, like a conductor commanding an orchestra of chaos. They spoke, but their voice was not just a whisper now. It was everywhere, echoing through the air, reverberating in Solomon's mind. You cannot stop this, Solomon. The forces at play here are too ancient, too powerful for even you to understand. The cross you hold, the power of the cemetery, it's only a small part of what's possible. You've kept it buried, hidden, thinking you could protect it. But you have no idea what you're truly guarding. The figure's eyes glowed with a sickly light, their voice now a twisted harmony with the rift in the sky. The true path to immortality isn't found in preserving balance, it's found in breaking it. The laws that you think govern this world are fragile, like delicate glass. I will shatter them. When I do, there will be nothing but pure, unbridled power, no life, no death, just existence in its most unbound, raw form. The rift pulsed again, growing larger still. Solomon could feel the energy seeping into the air, prickling against his skin, threatening to overwhelm him. The sacred water that had once flowed so peacefully from the central well of the cemetery now began to boil, swirling in unnatural patterns as though it too were being pulled into the rift's gravity. But Solomon, despite the overwhelming weight of the figure's words, stood firm. His silver cross glowed brighter, the light now a beacon of resistance against the dark forces gathering around them. The balance had been disturbed, but it wasn't gone yet. There was still a sliver of hope. You've misunderstood everything, Solomon's voice rang out stronger than he felt. Balance isn't a prison, it's freedom. It's the way the universe breathes, the way life and death work together to create harmony. You don't control the fabric of reality by shattering it. You respect it. The figures smirk, twisted, amusement dancing in their eyes. You speak of harmony as if it is something sacred, but all it is, Solomon, is a veil that keeps you from seeing the true potential of what you can do. You and your guardians, you've spent your lives protecting a lie. The Project Cain, they were just the beginning. This cemetery, these protections, they were never meant to be kept secret. They were meant to be unleashed. The air around them thickened, swirling with a dangerous, oppressive force as the figure took another step forward, their hands now crackling with energy, ready to unleash whatever dark power they had absorbed from the rift. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air, not from the figure, but from the earth itself. The ground shook violently as though something beneath it was awakening. Something older than the cemetery, older than the stars themselves. The very core of the earth seemed to react, as though it were resisting the power the figure was trying to harness. Solomon's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The cemetery wasn't just a place of protection, it was a connection. It was part of something much larger, a living entity, a force designed to stabilize not only the mortal world, but the very flow of time and space itself. He had always known the stakes, but now the true weight of his role was clear. If this force was truly awakened, it would tear apart everything they had ever known. From the rift above, a deep guttural voice boomed, a voice not of one but of many. 1,000 voices twisted together, speaking as one. Thy balance has been broken. The cycle is incomplete. Life and death no longer hold dominion. Return to the void. Solomon's eyes widened. He could feel the very earth beneath him shifting, unstable now, as if the ancient forces of life and death were buckling under the pressure of the rift. Time itself seemed to bend, as though the boundary between the present and eternity was thinning, collapsing inward. No. Solomon breathed, clutching the cross to his chest. This isn't how it was meant to be. You can't undo what has been built. The figure laughed again, a sound full of triumph and madness. I can, Solomon. I will. They raised there. Hands high and with a violent wave, the rift pulsed once more, sending waves of dark energy crashing toward him. But before the energy could strike, a new force, powerful, pure, and filled with light, crashed into the scene like a tidal wave. The ground beneath Solomon's feet shuddered as a bright, blinding light flared from the center of the cemetery. The sacred water that had once seemed a passive element now rose into the air, swirling and glowing like liquid starlight, forming a barrier between Solomon and the figure. It shimmered like a protective shield, refracting the dark energy sent toward them into harmless sparks. The figure recoiled, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Impossible. I don't think you understand, a voice called out from the blinding light. Solomon turned, and his heart soared in recognition. Eleanor, standing tall, her music box glowing with an ethereal light, had stepped forward, her presence radiating with the power of the cemetery itself. The melodies that had once been soft and calming now played with a new divine purpose, each note reverberating in harmony with the very fabric of existence, reshaping the air around them. Behind her, a figure emerged from the shadows. Harrison, his eyes burning with the same clarity he had once gained when freed from Cain's prison. His presence was like a magnet to the forces of the universe, a grounded center in the chaos that now surrounded them. Solomon, Harrison said, his voice steady. We're not alone in this. The combined forces of the cemetery, the sacred water, the music, the cross, all of it pulsed in unison, responding to the presence of the group, like a wellspring of power being drawn from the very heart of the earth. With one final coordinated motion, Solomon raised his cross high, channeling all the energy they had gathered into the center of the rift. The cemetery's defenses, awakened by their presence, surged forward, and the energy of the stars above descended like a divine wave, crashing into the tear in reality. "No!" the figure screamed, their voice unraveling, the sound distorted by the sheer magnitude of the cosmic forces at play. "This cannot," but it was too late. The rift shuddered, crackling with light and dark forces battling for supremacy. And then, with a sound like the breaking of 1,000 chains, it collapsed, the energy released in a brilliant, blinding explosion that threw the figure back, their form disintegrating into the ether. The ground beneath them began to stabilize, and the energy that had once threatened to tear apart the fabric of existence began to settle. The cemetery, the sacred water, and the protective forces around them slowly returned to a state of calm. Breathing heavily, Solomon looked around, seeing Eleanor, Harrison, and the others standing strong beside him. The darkness had been driven back, but they knew this victory was only temporary. The balance had been restored, but the forces they had faced had not been completely erased. There would always be those who sought to control what was never meant to be controlled. But for now, the cemetery stood strong, its power intact. For now, they had won. The echoes of the battle slowly faded, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. The stars, which had flickered and shifted unnaturally, now resumed their familiar patterns, as though the sky itself was taking a deep breath, relieved that the rift had been sealed. The sacred water, once swirling with chaos, now settled in its well, its gentle ripples returning to their calm, steady rhythm. But despite the momentary peace, Solomon knew better than to believe the war was over. As the light from Eleanor's music box faded, she stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. The harmonious notes that had once flowed from the box now seemed to resonate with a quiet, steady pulse, as if the box itself was recovering from the strain of the battle. Solomon's gaze met hers, and for a moment, words weren't necessary. They both understood the weight of what had happened, and the danger still lurking on the horizon. The figure they had confronted might have been vanquished, but Solomon could feel the echo of its presence, a lingering shadow that still clung to the edges of reality. "We've stopped the immediate threat," Eleanor said softly, her voice betraying a quiet exhaustion. "But we both know it's not over. There are others out there, more who will try to breach these walls, to destroy what we've built. More who want to unbind death from its place in the world." Solomon nodded, his hand tightening around the cross once more, feeling its reassuring weight. "We've restored the balance for now, but you're right. We've only scratched the surface. There are still forces at play, hidden in the corners of the world, waiting for the next opportunity to strike." Harrison, standing next to Eleanor, scanned the horizon, his gaze hardened and wary. His military precision hadn't dulled despite his time spent in the metaphysical realms. "We're going to need more than just the power of this cemetery," he said. "If we're going to keep the world from unraveling, we need to find the root of these disturbances before they spread beyond this place." Solomon's mind raced as the implications of Harrison's words sank in. The figure they had faced, that entity, whoever they were, had known something they hadn't. They had spoken of a greater plan, a deeper understanding of the forces they had tried to control. And if the rift had truly been closed, it was only a matter of time before someone else would find a way to open it again. Solomon turned to the others. "We need to go back to the source. We need to learn more about the founding families, the symbols, the ancient texts. There has to be something we've missed. Something that can help us understand how these forces are manipulating the balance of life and death." "We're not alone in this fight," Eleanor said, her voice firm, though still tinged with the weight of what they had just endured. "We have the cemetery's power on our side, but we also have each other, and we have the Guardians." "Guardians?" Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the spirits trapped here?" Eleanor nodded. Not just the spirits. The guardians are the ones who kept this place safe for centuries. They're connected to the very energy that runs through the cemetery. They were waiting for someone worthy to guide them, to awaken them. They've been silent for a long time, but now they're stirring. They will help us. Solomon closed his eyes, a deep breath drawing in as he tried to sense the subtle currents of energy beneath their feet, the heartbeat of the cemetery itself. He could feel it now, an ancient, quiet presence, a resonance deep within the earth. The Guardians had awoken, not just as passive entities, but as active protectors, ready to stand by them in this fight. "We are not without allies," Solomon said, opening his eyes. "But we must be careful. The forces we're up against are older than any of us. They understand the limits of our power, and they'll keep testing those limits until they find a way to breach them." Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence, a low rumble, like the growl of something awakening from a deep slumber. Solomon's eyes snapped toward the horizon, narrowing. The ground beneath them began to tremble again, but this time it wasn't just the restless energy of the cemetery. It felt different, darker. "Something's coming," Harrison muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he still carried, though he knew it would be no match for what they had just faced. Eleanor's eyes widened. "It's them. It's the other entities, the ones that the project's work had disturbed. They've been waiting for this moment." Solomon didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and began walking toward the cemetery's heart, toward the central, where the sacred water had once swirled, in opposition to the forces they had battled. He had no time to explain, no time to formulate a perfect plan. The battle was far from over. "I need to know everything," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We need to be ready. If we're to have any chance of stopping them, we need to understand what the project unleashed. We need to find the origins of that power and the key to locking it away forever." As they followed him, Solomon could feel the weight of their responsibility growing heavier with each step. The figures that had once lurked in the shadows of Cain's twisted experiments were no longer distant specters. They had a name, a presence, and most importantly, a purpose. They had learned from the mistakes of those who had tried to control death, and now they were coming to reclaim what had been taken, and this time they would be ready. The path before them was uncertain, the future unclear, but one thing was certain. Solomon would stand at the forefront of the battle to keep the balance intact. They had to protect the world from the forces that sought to unmake it. It was no longer just about stopping one man's twisted ambition. It was about saving the very fabric of existence itself. The Guardians were stirring, the cemetery was awakening, and the forces of life and death would not rest until the scales were tipped. But as Solomon gazed out at the horizon, he could feel the answers coming. They weren't just going to fight for survival, they were going to uncover the truth. And in doing so, they would find a way to preserve the balance. Before it was too late. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.